Chapter 578. Abduction in the Intis Embassy of the City of Generosity, Byam. Helene sat in front of a dresser, looking at her beautiful yet somewhat frail reflection. She sat there in a daze for several minutes. Her escape from the Black Death had been filled with anticipation and torment. She was afraid that any tiny mishap would cause her to be discovered by pirates or adventurers, causing her to be caught by Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy once again and making her lose all her freedom. She would then never be able to return to her hometown and return to the life she originally enjoyed. Only when she used the meager connections left by her family did she manage to hide inside her country's embassy and obtain a ticket to leave the sea, providing her a little relief. However, this still wasn't enough to make her feel at ease. She believed that everything would only be truly over when she stepped onto the northern continent. With this in mind, Helene couldn't help but raise her right hand and touch her cheeks, which weren't considered fair but was sufficiently healthy. She realized that her exquisiteness had improved significantly since her time as a sea merchant. She felt like time had reversed, making her mistake herself as returning to her days as a young lady. In fact, after entering the Intis Embassy, she had an additional choice other than escaping the sea. Cooperate with the Church of Storms, Loans Military, or the Embassy. By using herself as bait, they could capture Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy. But after considerable thought, she finally gave up on this plan. She even begged her family elder, who was an officer in the embassy, to keep the information of her hiding in there from others. Regardless, she ultimately didn't cause me any actual harm. Many a time, she indulged and satisfied me. Apart from every night. Every night. But that's only on the surface. Amid her recollections, Helene quickly blushed red. Those intoxicating nights, the fiery passion from having limbs intertwined with each other, and the unimaginable pleasure flashed past her mind, leaving her unable to compose herself. Helene slowly took a deep breath before exhaling. She shook her head and made her pining for freedom, her homeland, and her family occupy her heart again. She once again looked at her reflection and coiled up her drooping red hair. Then, she thickened her eyebrows with makeup and darkened the contours, making her facial features sharper and pronounced. After this round of makeup, Helene looked more androgynous, with a masculine air to her. Finally, she took off her clothes and used a cloth to flatten her chest. She then wore a white shirt, a black vest, men's trousers, and a double-breasted frock coat. Finally, she took a silk hat and wore it on her head, hiding the coiled red hair inside. At this moment, her reflection appeared more like a handsome young man than a lady. Her emerald-like eyes specifically seemed to suit her getup, giving her an alluring level of profundity. Helene patiently waited until someone knocked on her door. She picked up her luggage and walked out the door. She followed the good friend of her senior family member all the way to the side door in the embassy's garden. A carriage was there waiting for her. It was to send her to the harbor, where she would board a liner and head for the Lone Kingdom's Pritz Harbor. There, she would make a detour to return to Intis. Helene had anti-tracking beyond her powers. She carefully observed the surroundings, including the carriage driver. A thin and virile local. Doesn't like wearing hats. His looks are identical to the one I met before. He looks a little nervous, but that's normal. After Helene did her final checks, she thanked her family senior's friend, carried her luggage, and boarded the carriage. As the wheels started to roll, she pursed her lips and looked out the window, watching one Intis parasol tree after another being quickly left behind. This gave her an inexplicable feeling as though she was back in Trier. It was a huge city filled with sunshine, located in the region of the Rhine River and Srenzo River. It was a radiant and enchanting scene with all sorts of roses. It was a place with bustling arts and humanities, a sacred land for artists, musicians, and novelists. That was Intis's capital. After Emperor Roselle rebuilt it, it was in the true sense of the word, a world-class metropolis. It was also Helene's hometown. She grew up there and often cried when she saw it in her dreams. After an unknown period of time, Helene suddenly felt something was amiss. The surrounding streets were turning more deserted and remote. As a sea merchant, although she spent most of her time in the Fog Sea and wasn't too familiar with Byam in the Sonia Sea, being a Sequence 9 hunter made her sufficiently alert. Is this route correct? Helene moved from her seat and carefully asked the carriage driver. She was prepared to jump off the carriage and produce a fireball at any moment. The carriage driver didn't look back as he continued looking forward. He said with a sycophant smile, "Honorable lady, this route is closer, and it's not that easy to get into jams. As you know, Byam was built years ago. Back then, there weren't that many people or carriages. Many streets are narrow. Around noon and in the evening, it's very easy to encounter jams. Walking would be even faster than taking a carriage. Is that so? Helene thought about it and believed his explanation. This was because she had encountered such situations in several cities. Trier is still the best. When Emperor Roselle reformed the old city districts, he had the foresight to widen the roads. There's sufficient space even today. Helene had this thought flash through her mind when she heard the horse pulling the carriage neigh, seemingly in pain. Wait a moment. It seems to have stepped on something. The carriage driver stopped the carriage to the side and jumped off. Helene originally didn't think much of it, but sweeping the area with the corner of her eye, she realized that they were in an uninhabited quiet alley. Her heartstrings tightened as she didn't hesitate to attempt breaking through the carriage walls and escape. Regardless of whether it was an overreaction or not, she believed that it was necessary. At that moment, an intense horror surged out from the bottom of her heart. It felt like she had been locked onto by an extremely hungry monster. The pressure she felt at a spiritual level left her hesitant. She didn't dare to rashly take action. Following that, she heard a deep voice. I won't harm you. I have some questions for you. Helene's mind raced as she quickly considered the options placed before her. Ultimately, she didn't rashly escape. She sat back in her spot under the tremendously terrifying pressure. She planned on assessing the situation first before adjusting her plans. The door to the carriage opened, and the thin and virile local carriage driver walked in. He sat opposite Helene, and he was none other than Faceless Klein. In order to act as the carriage driver, he had specifically practiced how to drive a horse and carriage. This was a technique he had failed to properly learn while he was on the Contingency's Nighthawk squad. Due to the little amount of time he had, he didn't master it sufficiently and could only use Creeping Hunger's aura to successfully make the horse obedient. At the same time, Danitz, who was hidden nearby, quickly ran over and took the carriage driver's seat and began driving the carriage. His round felt hat was pressed low, and he was dressed like a real carriage driver. Helene bent her back in a guarded manner, like a leopard who was ready to pounce at any time. She felt that the gaze of the man opposite her was sweeping through her forehead, her eyebrows, her eyes, nose, mouth, neck, chest, waist and legs. It left her extremely uneasy. She had encountered such gazes and methods of sizing her up back in Intis, in Trier, and during the days when she was out at sea. It was something that disgusting perverts filled with sexual desires possessed. But this time, she strangely didn't feel insulted. She didn't have the feeling that the man would rip off her clothes or was fantasizing about something abnormal. Instead, he looks like he's studying food. He's like a icy cold snake that's slithering across my skin. Helene finally couldn't bear it as she asked, "What questions do you have?" After fully grasping her looks and features, Klein leaned forward and placed his arms on his thighs in a natural manner. He slightly clasped his palms and said, "Have you heard of a person named Jimmy Necker?" Helene took a few seconds to recall before firmly shaking her head. She slightly frowned and asked in a daze, "Have you gotten the wrong person? He's a tycoon, someone who likes to collect things." "Have you heard of such a person from Tracy?" Klein asked again. "Tracy." Helene sighed secretly and replied seriously, "No. She never mentioned a tycoon who likes collecting." Klein looked at the red-haired lady's eyes and said with an unhurried tone, "Then, does her room have any ancient documents regarding the southern continent's Balam Empire?" "No. She's not someone who enjoys reading documents. She hates reading. She even gets me to read novels to her." With that said, Helene revealed a bitter smile. "What novels does she read?" Klein asked without a change in tone. "Those classics by Roselle, as well as any contemporary romance stories," Helene answered frankly. Klein nodded. "Does she have a collector's room?" "Yes, but apart from her and a few mysterious visitors, no one is allowed entry, including me," Helene said as she recalled. Klein fell silent for a few seconds as he maintained an unchanging posture. "Tell me your story." "Mine?" Helene pointed at herself in surprise. Klein nodded gently without repeating himself. Helene said after momentarily being dazed, "My story is very simple. My father is a member of the former Sauron royal family of Intis. He received quite a bit of wealth, but he lost himself to alcohol, mistresses, marijuana, and gambling, causing him to eventually go bankrupt. In order to repay the debts, I chose to accept some conditions raised by the family and became a beyonder. I then went out to sea to become a sea merchant." Chapter 579. Academic question. As she spoke, Helene's eyes moved up slightly as though she was immersed in her memories. Early on, I transported iron and coal from Mid-Sea Shear to Fainapotter. Then I shipped back tobacco, coffee, cocoa, and other native specialties back to Intis. This is a sea route that borders the shore, so it was rather safe. The competition was intense as well. In order to quickly get out of my predicament and save up money, I worked hard to raise my sequence, hoping that I could trade in the colonies. Unfortunately, just as I familiarized myself with the sea route and made some money, I chanced upon ailment maiden Tracy, who wasn't Vice Admiral Ailment at the time, in one of her raids during my second trip to West Balam. She only had one ship back then, but she was very powerful. My partner and I resisted with our lives, but all of that was in vain. She doesn't have the habit of killing mindlessly. All she did was snatch the goods, as well as myself. As expected of an oddity among demonesses, Klein listened in silence and used his clown powers to suppress his embarrassed emotions to expressionlessly ask, "How far did the relationship between the two of you go?" "We didn't," Helene instinctively denied. "She forced me. I didn't want to die. I could only choose to accept it. Besides, she's a woman." "Lady, there's no need to get so worked up. If I had asked if the two of you had a relationship that went beyond friendship, would you have jumped out? It's only because I'm kind enough and had considered your shame which had prevented me from being so direct." Sigh. Under the facade of the crazy Gairman Sparrow is a gentlemanly me. That's the true me. Klein switched to asking without a change in expression, "What kind of food do you like? Are there any dishes you especially like? Do you prefer sweet or salty food, or somewhere in between? What food do you dislike? What food are you allergic to? Do you have any dietary restrictions? If you do, what are they?" These questions made Helene feel like she was in a dream, as though everything was surreal. She never imagined that the man would ask her such questions. It was like a pursuer was asking his crush what hobbies she had. No pursuer would ask such questions. These are all indirectly obtained from numerous chats, or are obtained by other means. No woman would like to be questioned like that. This is like a survey which Emperor Roselle created. What does he want? He's asking these questions without any expression. "I'm so afraid." Helene fell silent for a few seconds before answering them one after another under Klein's cold, unmoving gaze. Klein maintained his seating posture of leaning forward and continued asking, "How do you usually sit? Do you have any habitual motions?" The more Helene answered, the more panicked she became. She had the inexplicable feeling that answering these questions would make her disappear. By the time the perplexing and terrifying survey was done, she felt heavy deep down, constantly suspecting that a terrible outcome awaited her. Why don't I risk it and jump off the carriage while he isn't paying attention? Helene seriously considered the possibility. However, the man didn't seem to have any indication of attacking her, and this made her indecisive. She felt that there was hope to resolve the matter amicably. After grasping Helene's personality, habits and preferences, Klein turned the topic towards Vice Admiral Ailment. "What do you know of Tracy?" Helene fell silent as her mouth quivered a few times. She couldn't bring herself to speak. After the carriage continued on for quite a while, it was only then that she finally smiled ruefully. "She possesses excellent combat abilities. She's good at infiltration and curses, with her being capable of turning invisible and becoming light. She grasps the means of swapping bodies with a mirror or magic staff, as well as black flames and frost. She can make enemies in a certain range suddenly fall sick, including colds, pneumonia, gastroenteritis, and other illnesses. The longer the fight lasts with her, the worse the ailments inflicted. Some Beyonders might even directly die from a heart attack. She can also create invisible threads to control her enemy. She knows human anatomy very well. She can easily give people pleasure through contact, that kind of pleasure. She has an active charming ability that would make many pirates give up putting up a resistance once they're near her. She's often friendly, but she's cruel to her enemies. She enjoys destroying the perfection that others would wish to protect, making them suffer immense pain and torment. Helene didn't go into detail on how Tracy destroyed the state of perfection of others. There were many cruel stories and hilarious matters. This ailment maiden had once made her enemies, a father and son duo, kill each other, as well as instigate an enemy's wife to betray him and let him come across the scene. As expected of a demoness. She's a sequence 5 demoness who's one sequence higher than demoness of pleasure. Klein gained a basic grasp of Tracy's combat style, and he calmly asked again, "Does she have any mystical items?" "Yes. A bangle that's inlaid with diamonds. As long as she wears it, it's very difficult for Tracy to be injured." Helene hesitated before revealing Vice Admiral Ailment's secret. Klein asked a few other detailed questions as he straightened his body a little. "Tracy is helping the Demonist sect perform human trafficking?" This was something he took great notice of when he heard Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina mention it. The Demonist sect cooperated with Zanguil, and it was related to the royal family. It involved an underground ruin whose location was unknown. Tracy helped them in the human trafficking. Balin, who was pointed out by the Hanged Man, was someone who orchestrated numerous disappearance cases of slaves and the disappearance of primitive tribes in the southern continent. With him appearing at the underground ruins, he would be a member of the upper echelons. The biggest human trafficker, Capim, had Beyonders who were of the Arbiter pathway protecting him. And this is a pathway controlled by the Lone and Fainapotter royal families, as well as their military. All of these matters that Klein was aware of linked together to form a line, but he wasn't sure what it actually exposed. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy was a breakthrough point. "What Demonist sect?" Helene asked in puzzlement. "You don't have to know," Klein calmly replied. "If you don't know what a Demonist is and end up suspecting that the extremely charming Vice Admiral Ailment who gives you pleasure is a dirty and savage man, then I'm afraid that you would have lost control on the spot." "You don't have to thank me. I'm a good person," Klein lampooned inwardly. Helene suppressed her puzzlement and said while recalling, "In recent years, she's been busy shipping slaves. The other end of the trade is crazy Captain Connors Victor. Rumor has it that he and many human traffickers and slave merchants in Lone have a deep partnership." Crazy Captain Connors Victor. Klein remembered the nickname and name. He nodded and no longer spoke in a heavy voice. Instead, he said in a relatively gentle voice, "Did you involve yourself in such matters? Such as being a part-time pirate?" This very polite and amiable tone left Danitz trembling for some baffling reason. He felt that Gehrman Sparrow being in such a state was much more terrifying than his cold and expressionless state. "No." Helene shook her head. "The blood of the Sauron family flows in me. I will not bring shame to my family. Besides, Tracy always said that she wouldn't let me be tainted by bloodshed and darkness. All of that would be faced by her. She must have read too many romance novels." Klein took out a gold coin and allowed it to weave between his fingers like it was dancing. He didn't keep it from Helene as he performed a divination in front of her to confirm that she wasn't lying. The result was that she was rather honest. "This is also because I didn't ask in detail about her emotional entanglements with Tracy. Otherwise, she wouldn't be that honest." Klein secretly reflected and put away the gold coin. At that moment in time, the carriage had circled around the harbor, no longer heading for the ship that Helene was meant to board. Klein looked at the scenery outside the window and took out a small metal bottle. He handed it to Helene and said, "Use the liquid inside to wipe away your makeup." "Why?" Helene subconsciously asked. "This isn't something you should be asking," Klein leaned forward once again and said without expression. Despite feeling aggrieved and furious, Helene didn't wish to agitate the man and get on his bad side at such a critical moment. She could only remove the bottle cap and took a sniff at it to test if it was poisonous. "Can it be used directly?" she asked. Klein tersely acknowledged in the affirmative. Helene took out a white handkerchief and dabbed it with the bottle's liquid. Then, she began wiping her face and quickly cleaned away her prior disguise. Her aesthetically pleasing masculinity vanished and her contours became softer as Helene's original looks were presented before Klein. After careful observation, Klein calmly said, "Take off your hat and let down your hair." Helene furrowed her brows and had a nagging feeling that what followed would be unacceptable instructions such as taking off her clothes. She took a deep breath, removed her hat, and released her coiled red hair. Immediately, she appeared extremely feminine. Klein straightened his body and leaned back on the carriage wall before calmly instructing, "You can put on your disguise again." Is he a madman? After all this, he wants me to revert to how I was before? Helene didn't dare to voice her displeasure, afraid that the man would raise unacceptable requests. She hurriedly opened her suitcase and took out a mirror to look at herself. The makeup has been removed so cleanly. She was stunned for a moment before she quickly put on makeup and coiled her hair. When the carriage came to a stop, she was already looking like a handsome young man. Klein nodded indiscernibly and looked out the window before retracting his gaze. "One last question." "What?" Helene asked nervously. Klein raised his line of sight a little as his facial muscles moved. How big are your breasts? Helene was first taken aback before her face flushed red. This wasn't a redness caused by embarrassment, but an anger from wanting to punch the man in the chin. Klein didn't move his gaze as he calmly added, "It's an academic question." Noticing no sexual intent from his eyes, Helene inhaled and closed her eyes to answer the question. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and took out a boat ticket and a stack of papers. New identification. Tickets to Tiana Port. Once you're there, buy tickets to Pritz Harbor. Helene glanced at him vigilantly before receiving the tickets and documents. She carried her suitcase and carefully alighted the carriage to see the ship she was taking. Klein followed behind her and watched her leave. From the corner of his eye, he saw Danitz trying hard to hold back his laughter. Chapter 580. Wormtongue. Klein slowly turned his head and shot a glance at Danitz. The pirate with a bounty of 5,500 pounds immediately shut his mouth and clamped up. It was as though nothing had happened. After confirming that Helene boarded the liner without issues, he turned around and walked to the side of the carriage. He pretended to casually ask, "Did you hear the conversation?" No. "A little, just a little." Danitz shook his head as he gave a hollow chuckle. Klein nodded slightly and said, "You have to remember. Otherwise it'll be easy for people to see through you." "See through me?" Danitz raised his hand and pointed at his nose and said blankly. Klein said without changing his expression, "She's from the Sauron family. She has anti-tracking beyonder abilities. Together with her tics and behavior, it can be confirmed that she's a Sequence 7 from the Hunter Pathway, Pyromaniac. She's very similar to you, and you'll be able to do a good job acting as her." "Me? I won't do. I won't be able to disguise myself like her. I'll be identified with just a look." Danitz jumped in fright. Klein held back his laughter and said in a deep voice, "I'll lend you creeping hunger." No. I have no experience in such matters. I won't be able to fool Vice Admiral Ailment's subordinates." Abnormally nervous and horrified, Danitz declined the mission. To him, this was an extremely embarrassing and dog's-hit matter. Only a pervert or a madman would complete it without any qualms. Klein nodded in agreement and said without an expression, "Indeed, you are rather stupid." Danitz forced a smile. "Yes, I'm very stupid." Klein didn't say a word as he walked past Danitz and opened the door to the carriage. Danitz followed him with his eyes when he suddenly saw Gehrman Sparrow's hair turn red. He blinked his dull eyes and saw the man's facial contours turn soft and his eyes turning emerald green. His lips turned thin as they pursed, making him look frail and insecure. He had a masculine beauty and looked identical to Helene, who had just left. After watching Gehrman Sparrow enter the carriage, Danitz turned his head back as the corners of his mouth twitched. He was silent for a few seconds before he muttered silently, "What a madman." He changed into a woman without any hesitation. I have to say that Helene looks pretty good when disguised as a man. This beyonder power sure is useful. If I can receive an item like that and figure out what Captain's ideal type is, then I can make the corresponding changes and make her fall in love with me. But in that case, would the person that she falls in love with still be me? Danitz found himself pondering over philosophical questions until he heard a cough from the carriage behind him. He snapped to his senses and drove the carriage away from the harbor. He planned on making a huge detour before circling back. Inside the carriage, Klein wasn't as calm as he appeared. Although Helene was in male clothes, allowing him to temporarily not bother about the most embarrassing parts, he still felt quite embarrassed to have his face change into a woman's while squeezing out breasts. This left him feeling down and awkward. Sigh, a faceless change in appearance is very easy. The difficult part is apparently the mind. To act as a good faceless, I'll have to cross many mental blocks. If I don't, then I'll have to spend a great deal of time to act as a real person for many years. My identity has to be recognized by everyone as I fully immerse myself into that character until I almost treat it like it's real. This is more challenging on my bottom line. It's crazy and warped. To speed up my progress, I have to overcome a certain number of obstacles. Klein pulled out a suitcase from under the carriage's seat. He rummaged for some cloth and clothes before replicating Helene's disguise. He could have gotten Danitz to act as Helene and borrow the mystical item with the faceless beyonder characteristic from Justice for a few days without a problem. However, that meant that there was a high chance of Danitz facing Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy directly. Without the clown's powers, it was almost impossible for him to hide it from her, putting his life in extreme danger. It was impossible for Klein to make others bear such huge risks for his own matters. Therefore, he could only challenge himself and do it himself. Soon, he looked identical to Helene. Under the black top hat was a handsome androgynous face with soft and pronounced contours. His emerald green eyes looked as beautiful as gems. He adjusted his build, making himself shorter by a few centimeters and narrowing his shoulder width. His frame shrank and he looked like he had lightened significantly. His current appearance quickly surfaced in Klein's mind with his clown powers. It's still not bad. There's not much to it. Perhaps it's because I'm not in female clothes, so it doesn't feel much different from turning into Gehrman's Sparrow, Danitz, or someone else. I just look prettier and have some discomfort in my chest. If I look like that on Earth, I wouldn't have needed to worry about not having a girlfriend. He mocked and consoled himself as he curled the corners of his mouth. What looked like a normal action on Gehrman's Sparrow now looked pitiful and sorry. Fuck. Klein cursed silently as he quickly adjusted his state of mind. Bit by bit, he immersed himself into the state of true acting. With the passage of time, he discovered that the resistance he had lessened significantly. Following that, he felt relaxed and calm as though the potion had harmonized itself further. And that meant that the speed of his digestion would speed up. It really is useful, Klein said silently as he got up and took 4 steps counterclockwise. He went above the gray fog and once again confirmed the danger level of his upcoming operation. After returning to the real world, he switched to using Helene's voice and deliberately suppressed it. Head to Pier 6 at the harbor. Danitz didn't find anything amiss, but he suddenly came to a realization after changing directions. He couldn't help but tremble. It's like the real person. I wouldn't be able to distinguish him if the day comes where he transforms into captain to fool me. After a while, the carriage re-entered the harbor and went to the liner which Helene was originally meant to board. But it didn't truly approach it and had instead circled around to a nearby warehouse. Danitz jumped off the carriage and knocked on the warehouse's door, according to a prior agreed pattern. Out came a group of dock workers who were clearly of native blood. Following that they made way. After confirming that there wasn't anything amiss, the bald member of the resistance, Kalat, came out on a wheelchair. Where is she? He looked at Danitz as he asked. Through Helene's matter, Danitz had successfully established communications with the resistance. Danitz laughed mischievously. In the carriage. She's been drugged with medicine that makes her lose her strength. Its effects will last another 10 hours. Remember, I want 70% of the 1,000-pound reward. Kalat raised his right arm and waved it. Immediately 2 thin members of the resistance got onto the carriage. Boss, it's that woman. They soon poked their heads out and said in the tone of a local gang. Take her down. Our mission is to protect her, Kalat emphasized again. Helene, who was disguised as a male, was helped down from the carriage with 2 soldiers supporting her on either side of her with his control as a clown. Klein pretended to be weak in the knees as he staggered. He was soon moved to a room among the Biam populace. At the same time, Kalat instructed a local gang member, who believed in Sea God, to find strongman Ozil and tell him that they had found the target. He was to bring 1,000 pounds in exchange for the woman. As for Danitz, he had returned to the inn to await the news. At noon, Ozil replied saying that he couldn't be sure if the person was the real deal and had planned on sending a person over to confirm things. Kalat agreed to his request. Closer to the evening, a figure appeared outside the house. He was a man wearing pantaloons and a jacket. He was Loanese and was dressed in the style of a native. He had short brows, about half of the average person's. His brown eyes were recessed, and his face looked cut. Kalat pushed himself on a wheelchair and appeared by the door. After seeing the man, he said in a heavy voice, Mitha King? Should I be honored that you actually know me? The man laughed. He was originally a captain of one of the pirate ships under Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. After Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy took over the crew, he took on the role as third mate of her flagship, the Black Death. His nickname was Wormtongue, with a bounty of 5,400 pounds. Kalat didn't reply as he wheeled himself to make way. Mither entered a nearby room after being led by a gang member. Inside, he saw Helene sitting by the bedside in a gentleman's outfit. Her eyes were darting about and glaring at him. Her teeth bit down on her lip as she looked furious and fearful while having feelings of despair and obstinacy. It's her all right. However, I can't be certain because she's wearing thick makeup. It's hard to tell what a woman really looks like once they don thick makeup. Wipe her face clean for me. Hey, why didn't you cuff her? Don't you know she's dangerous? Mither surveyed the area and took 2 steps back in a guarded manner. She's been drugged. She doesn't have much strength and hasn't resisted. But since you asked, Kalat lifted his chin to a resistant soldier. The soldier found a pair of cuffs and walked over. After pulling Klein's hands back, he cuffed him. Klein continued wearing mixed emotions like before, trying hard to act like he was struggling despite having a lack of strength. Then, another gang member got some water and wiped his face with a rough towel. Thankfully, most of the makeup in this era isn't waterproof. Klein began changing his face's contours as the towel covered his face. Before long, Mither saw Helene's moist face. She looked extraordinarily frail and beautiful in this state. Her emerald green eyes shot out with intense hatred and a look of perplexity. Unfortunately, she's captain's. Mither's throat moved. As a man and a pirate, he often fantasized about Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and red-haired Helene falling into his embrace at the same time, but of course, it was only his imagination. The way he looks at me is disgusting. Klein nearly puked. Although he knew that it was targeted at red-haired Helene and had nothing to do with him, he couldn't help but feel goosebumps. In that instant, he got to know the real him a little deeper. He knew what things he couldn't accept at all. It really is her. Mither turned his head and said to Kalat, "This is your reward." He threw the tiny leather bag in his hand over to him. Kalat did a brief inspection and threw it to his subordinate. He pondered for a second and said, "We still need your help." "No problem. Seek out Oziel when needed." Mither pointed to red-haired Helene in the room and asked, "I'll take her away, right?" "Yes." Kalat made way once again. Klein didn't wish to be helped by Mither, as he pretended to have regained some of his mobility while stumbling out. Mither was afraid of Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, so he could only hold her by her shoulder and lead her to the carriage parked outside. The carriage left the city and came to a private harbor. Mither led Klein, who was disguised as red-haired Helene, onto a fishing boat which had been long prepared. Under the cover of the night, they left Byam. After about an hour, they saw a ship docked under the shadow of an island's cliff. Fluttering in the wind was a huge flag with white bones drawn on it. Black Death. Chapter 581. Both getting into character and detachment, only a single Black Death. The other ships are anchored beyond the Rorstad archipelago's confines because they're afraid of being discovered? This is good news. Klein retracted his gaze and deliberately bit his lip to express his agitation. After taking a glance at Helene's side profile, Mither lit a torch and began swinging it to signal to the flagship. Before long, a dinghy came and took him and the disguised Klein back to the Black Death. As the dinghy was being hoisted up, Klein boarded another pirate admiral's flagship. Under Mither's lead, he entered the cabin. Waiting for them up ahead was a blonde female attendant. She glanced at Helene with a cold stare before pointing sideways to the room. "Go in." This attitude. It's like meeting a love rival in the flesh. Both men and women fall to this Vice Admiral Ailment's charm. The cuffed Klein instantly increased his vigilance as he wore a heavy expression and followed the blonde female attendant into the room. He originally believed that he would immediately meet Tracy and obtain a chance to meet her in private. He was already ready to strike, but apart from a wardrobe, sofa, and full-body mirror in a cramped carpeted room, there was nothing. Could it be that Tracy has deliberately given Helene the cold shoulder to express her anger? Klein recalled the romance novels and contrived television serials he had previously watched while contemplating the reason for the ailment maiden's actions. The blonde female attendant shot a glance at Helene's male attire that lacked the androgynous beauty to it due to the lack of makeup, took 2 quick steps, opened the wardrobe, and pointed to the dresses inside. "Captain doesn't like your present attire. Change." Fuck. Klein cursed inwardly. He originally imagined that he could be granted a meeting with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy while looking like Helene and dressed as a male. He was thankful that he didn't need to overly humiliate himself to achieve his goal, but in the end, he didn't manage to escape this outcome that he wanted to avoid. Seeing Helene standing there in a daze, the blonde female attendant glared at her. "You have 2 choices. Either you change yourself, or I'll help you." Klein did one of red-haired Helene's habitual motions and inhaled slightly. "Remove my cuffs." He turned his body sideways and gestured with his chin towards the door. "And go outside." Conniving whore. The blonde female attendant cursed under her breath and used the key given to her by Mither to release Helene from her cuffs. After she left the room and closed the door, Klein walked to the wardrobe and stood there in a daze for 20 seconds. Suddenly, he closed his eyes and extended his right hand. After an unknown period of time, he came in front of the full-body mirror and saw Helene's red hair cascading down in the reflection. Her green eyes shimmered while she wore a golden-red dress. By her waist was a ribbon tied into a flower. It was pulled tight, accentuating her slender waist. Helene's beautiful face was flushed red as her lips were tightly pursed. Her expression was heavy, looking very identical to the picture from before. Klein looked at his present image and first felt somewhat embarrassed. However, he had gotten over it to a certain extent while changing. Besides, there wasn't anyone inside. Second, he gradually found a different feeling. This wasn't to say that he was gradually liking such acts. Instead, while overcoming his mental aversion, he gained some form of detachment from his self-awareness. It felt like his soul had flown out of his body, allowing him to calmly observe Helene, dressing up in female attire and adjusting her clothes through the mirror with a calm attitude. He believed this was a necessary step in his mission, and that there was nothing embarrassing or odd about this. Klein felt a baffling sense of familiarity as he tried hard to recall and compare this feeling, in a bid to fix it in place and gain an understanding of it. Soon he found the source. This was similar to him playing role-playing games. In it, he could choose a female character, carefully choosing the facial features and attire of the character, allowing the beauty to please his eyes. There was nothing kinky or embarrassing while doing this. On the one hand, he was viewing it from an angle of a god through the screen, making his attitude detached, and on the other hand, he was seriously acting and going through the plot. By combining the two perfectly and not distinguishing between them, he didn't have any aversion to it because he was playing a game. Klein suddenly opened his half-closed eyes, feeling like this was the faceless state he had been searching for. He could act as anyone, but he was still only himself. As he got into character and worked hard to act, he could detach his feelings and observe things calmly. By making comparisons, he could figure himself out and find his true self. It's both getting into character and detachment. This is the actual application of the faceless main principle. Klein suddenly felt at peace as the remnant embarrassment coexisted with his changed attitude. With a detached attitude, as though he was playing a role-playing game, he observed himself in the full-body mirror and tried hard to find any flaws. Thankfully, I got Danitz to get 2 sets of female clothing to study the way it's all put together. Otherwise, there's no way I could wear them so quickly and normally as a first-timer. It will be easy to expose any flaws. This is called professionalism. Women's clothing sure is complicated. From the perspective of a faceless, there are many flaws in Helene's facial features and contours. She might be beautiful, but it's definitely nothing I call stunning. Yes, with this state of mind, I can clearly feel the potion digesting. Klein looked at himself in the mirror as though he was looking at a character named Helene. Thump, thump, thump. The blonde female attendant banged on the door and asked impatiently, "Are you not done?" Klein's face instantly sank, as though she hadn't returned him the 10,000 pounds she owed him. He maintained this state as he walked to the door and pulled it open. The blonde female attendant shot him a glance and raised the handcuffs. "Put your hands to your back. You're now a prisoner." As red-haired Helene was on the Black Death, she wasn't afraid that she would bring her any harm. All she wanted was to humiliate her as much as she could. Klein grunted and half-turned his body, putting his hands to his back. He felt relaxed because the woman wasn't paying too much attention to his attire. After putting on the cuffs, he was led by the blonde female attendant to the entrance of the captain's cabin. The door was half open, allowing a fragrance of warmth emanate outside. It wasn't too strong, but it was sufficiently long-lasting. It was a scent that kept pulling one back as they would involuntarily wish to head to bed for pleasure. The blonde female attendant knocked on the door and was just about to say a word when a gloomy but sufficiently beautiful female voice sounded from the inside. "Let her come in alone." The blonde attendant's face instantly sank as she pushed open the door, signaling with her eyes for Klein to enter. The moment of truth is here. Klein took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The door behind him closed with a thud, isolating the inside from the outside. Klein walked across the thick carpet and, using the candlelight from the golden candle racks, saw a rather beautiful lady sitting behind a desk while leaning back. She was wearing beige trousers with her feet extended diagonally while crossed. Her brows were long and straight, and her azure blue eyes were sharp and bright. She wore a white linen shirt, allowing her intimate body to faintly peek through. Raven black curled hair cascaded down to hide the critical bits, making Klein instantly feel uncomfortable. Upon seeing red-haired Helene enter, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy raised her left hand and asked with an ambiguous smile. "Tell me, how should I punish you?" She held a black leather whip in her hand. "Ma'am, there's always room for discussion." Klein lampooned to resist his discomfort. His eyes first moved upwards before leveling towards her. He said without a hint of emotion, "Returning to this place is already the greatest punishment. Anything else is just a bonus." "You're as stubborn as usual, yet always so indecisive." Tracy stood up. She was tall and slender, and under the illumination of the candlelight, her figure's shadows danced with extreme charm. She held back her smile and walked towards red-haired Helene, with a leather whip in her left hand. She didn't have an ounce of doubt. During this process, Klein noticed that she wore a bangle with inlaid diamonds on her right wrist. The mystical item described by Helene? It can reduce most forms of damage? Klein, who had originally planned to take action the moment the gap between them narrowed, held back his urge. "Oh, they cuffed you. That's nice." "We haven't played such a game before," Tracy said with a smile, but her azure blue eyes seemed to be a stormy ocean that was gathering strength. "Ma'am, your lines are quite terrible." Klein pursed his lips tightly and didn't say a word. Tracy came in front of him and raised her right hand to slide down his cheek. "Returning is the greatest punishment?" As she spoke, her eyes turned misty, looking extremely alluring. "You usually don't seem to think so. Although you always resist in the beginning, you're often more passionate than me towards the end." Before she finished her sentence, Klein pulled out his left hand from the handcuff, and he grabbed the bangle on her wrist in a manner that was as fast as lightning. He then violently swiped it down. At the same time, that hand turned a shade of gold. Klein's green and deep eyes suddenly lit up with two bolts of lightning. This was creeping hunger. This was psychic piercing. And the ability to pull his hand out of the cuffs was a magician power. It was the bone-softening power which Klein very seldom used. He had long made plans and preparation for what he would do after infiltrating. It was to find a chance to be alone with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, and assassinate her without holding back. Only by doing so did he have a chance of defeating a pirate admiral. Only by doing so could he severely injure and capture her. And even if it couldn't be done, he didn't mind killing her. He was already very accustomed to channeling spirits above the gray fog. He wasn't afraid of not being able to obtain the intelligence he needed. A human trafficker didn't deserve any pity. In addition, in order to prevent himself from tripping himself up, he only brought the most difficult-to-detect creeping hunger, which was good at disguising itself. The other mystical items were placed in the mysterious space above the gray fog. Furthermore, he was on the Black Death with several opposing Beyonders on board. He had to finish the battle as quickly as possible. This was also to avoid being taken down by Tracy's ailment powers. The longer he fought her, the worse the ailments inflicted on him would be. In that instant, the bangle with inlaid diamonds was removed from Tracy's wrist. Klein's green eyes flashed with lightning while the beautiful and charming Vice Admiral Ailment remained in a daze. All she did was instinctively dodge. She couldn't believe that Helene would attack her, or dare believe that she possessed such reactions and abilities. Chapter 582. Provocation. Tracy saw two bolts of lightning light up in Helene's beautiful emerald-like eyes as the blinding silver occupied her entire vision. Her beautifully contoured chin was suddenly lifted as though she was about to let out a tragic scream. However, she stiffened on the spot, shattering like a mirage. The full-body mirror placed in the room cracked and quickly crumbled, scattering to the floor. Mirror substitution spell. Tracy's figure, in her pure white shirt, beige trousers, and black leather boots, appeared in the corner where the full-body mirror was located. Before she could catch her breath, she heard heavy footsteps and saw red-haired Helene's dress fluttering to the back as she charged forward like a chariot. The glove she wore on her left hand was pale and gloomy green. Klein had already switched to a zombie state. His muscles were taut, and his strength had increased substantially. His sleeves fluttered as he clenched his fist tightly before throwing it at Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy like an iron hammer. Bang! 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 Although he continued maintaining Helene's appearance, his actions were like a ferocious beast's. He was fierce and formidable. As he bombarded Tracy with his punches and kicks, all she could do was desperately parry his attacks without having the time to use other Beyonder powers. If a Demoness of Affliction's corresponding Sequence 9 wasn't Assassin, allowing her to have extraordinary combat skills and dodging capabilities, this barrage of attacks would have left her heavily injured. Bang! 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 Klein's fist emanated a white, frosty air, causing Tracy to tremble with every time she made contact. Gradually, ice began to form on the surface of her body. This was a zombie's mastery of frost powers. Seeing her blood gradually stiffen, Tracy didn't hesitate and took the blow. Her lips turned pale as her mouth opened slightly as she let out a formless scream. Accompanied by this scream, a blue illusory halo surged out from her body. It left stacked layers of frost in its wake. In just 1 or 2 seconds, both of them found themselves in a frozen world. They were surrounded by thick and transparent ice, and there was loose frost blanketing the exterior. The two looked very close to one another, but they needed to break through the various obstructions to fight each other. A smile appeared on Tracy's gallant and brilliant face as a silent black flame ignited within her body. It quickly melted the surrounding ice as it began to launch a counterattack, allowing Ailment Maiden to grasp the advantage. At this moment in time, she saw Helene, who was often frail and indecisive, snap her fingers without an expression. A matchstick she hadn't noticed lit up as scarlet flames leaped. Instantly, it enveloped the red-haired figure's dress. Tracy's pupils constricted as her spiritual intuition gave her an extreme sense of foreboding. In the silent black flames behind her, Klein leaped out in the form of Helene. He extended both his arms and hugged Tracy, locking her arms in the process. At the same time, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" A formless air bullet shot out with might that exceeded that of a revolver. It was comparable to the latest rifle models. It passed through the void and accurately hit the back of Tracy's head. Oof! The bullet drilled through her skull, but Vice Admiral Ailment's figure suddenly contracted, turning into a broken black staff. Magic staff substitution spell. Tracy rapidly appeared diagonally across him. The buttons on her shirt dropped as she revealed a mesmerizing view of fair skin. However, what caught Klein's attention wasn't that but the blood on her palm. While Klein restrained Tracy, she had clawed behind her, ripping off a piece of fabric and injuring his thigh. At this moment, Tracy quickly opened and closed her mouth twice as illusory black flames appeared from her palms to burn the blood. This was black magic, a witch's curse. Klein couldn't help but tremble. A black flame ignited from within, from his soles to the top of his head. He was rapidly reduced to paper shreds. Just as he appeared in another corner, he felt countless invisible spider webs swirl towards him. Some were hard and attempted to bind him, while others were soft, in a bid to stimulate different parts of his body. Klein, who was a Beyonder who acted extremely calm during combat, felt his heart race as his ears heated up. His body turned numb and sore, having the discomfort of a cold while having the urge to have his blood surge downwards. Compared to Madame Sharon from Contingency, Tracy's spiderweb was far more terrifying. Klein didn't dare to underestimate it as he immediately snapped his fingers. The snap ignited all the surrounding spiderwebs as scarlet flames extended from where they came from and surged towards Tracy like a tidal wave. Back in Tingen, Klein already knew that the spiderwebs from a demoness of pleasure were weak against fire. Instantly, the middle of the room became a huge ignited web. Tracy was caught by surprise as the flames swept towards her. Humph! She exhaled as an eerie blue illusory light surged outwards and froze her within a transparent but gigantic crystal. The scarlet flames surged over and kept melting the ice, but it gradually weakened. Klein didn't pick up the diamond-inlaid bangle, because he wasn't sure what negative side effects it might have. To rashly use a mystical item without sufficient comprehension of it was highly likely to be harmful rather than beneficial. He straightened his body and opened his arms, letting his left glove be dyed in the lustrous glow of the sun. Priest of Light. At that instant Tracy, who was hiding inside the ice, felt that extremely familiar Helene wore a holy luster. In between her brows, an unprecedented tenacity surged out. She was pretty and no longer frail. Like a blooming sunflower, she was like a flower of war stained with blood. Tracy shouted with a clearly hoarse voice. "Who are you? Why don't you dare to show yourself? While wearing a dress, using my own looks would look so odd. It's more suitable to use Helene's appearance." Klein detached himself as this thought flashed through his mind. Following that, he praised the sun. A magnificent pure beam of light descended with golden flames swirling around it. It completely blanketed the ice and Tracy. As the ice rapidly melted and vanished at a discernible pace, the bright and holy light dimmed before disintegrating. The color in Tracy's face drained as she did a somersault and agilely dodged Klein's psychic piercing from his switch to the interrogator soul, letting whatever damage she received happen inside the beam of light. The light of holiness was strong against the undead and corrupt, so it was only considered an ordinary sequence 5 strike on a demoness. Bang, bang, bang. Tracy did multiple somersaults and dodged Klein's air bullets, leaving holes in the carpet. As she rolled, her figure vanished from her enemy's sight. A demoness invisibility. Klein bent his back slightly as he was on high guard. He then used his spiritual perception and his sense of danger as a clown to seek out Tracy's location. However, he was unable to find her in that short amount of time. Furthermore, his forehead was heating up and his lungs were burning. His throat hurt and itched. He nearly couldn't keep himself from coughing any longer. No, I can't let this drag out any longer. Klein's thoughts raced as he suddenly laughed deeply. He then used a stiff male's voice and said, "Helene told me your secrets. She also told me all of her secrets." Before he finished his sentence, his spiritual perception was triggered. This was because he discovered an intense emotional fluctuation in a particular corner. The emotions of rage and hatred were impossible to hide from him. Klein immediately turned around and looked over. Instantly, layers of golden scales appeared on his left glove. His eyes were tainted with a pale gold color as his pupils turned vertical. Silently, Tracy's figure was outlined as she wore a painful and twisted expression. Her extremely feminine raven-black curly hair grew uncontrollably as they spread in every direction. Psychiatrist's frenzy. Tracy, whose emotions had been stirred, nearly broke down when faced with such an attack. She temporarily lost her reasoning. Klein took the opportunity and snapped his fingers. An air bullet crossed the distance between them, heading straight for Tracy's face that remained beautiful despite the twisted expression. Suddenly, a wisp of thick, raven-black hair swept over, changing the trajectory of the air bullet. It struck Tracy in the left shoulder, causing her clothes to tear and blood to spurt. Even her bones were exposed. Ah! Tracy let out a shrill cry as immense amounts of black flames spewed out of her body and enveloped her. Following that, thick ice crystals formed outside the black flames. Beyond it, raven-black curly hair that frantically grew wrapped Tracy, the black flames, and the ice in thick layers. It seemed to form a gigantic cocoon made of human hair. Bang! 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 Klein's air bullets shot out one after another, but they only penetrated the black hair and got stuck in the ice. He paused and made his left glove emit the brilliance of the sun. At that moment his throat itched. Unable to control himself any further, he began coughing violently. He failed to produce the attacks he was preparing to deliver. Inside the black-haired cocoon, Tracy had recovered her senses. She raised her voice and shouted sharply, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" At that instant, Klein paused for a second. In his moment of adrift thoughts, he felt as though he had returned to Backland, returning to the first time he encountered the devil dog. He knew he wasn't its match and could only shout "Murder and save me," before successfully escaping from the danger. At that moment in time, Tracy's cries had the same effect. Even if there weren't a dozen Beyonders on the Black Death, the number was close to that. Furthermore, there were relatively many Beyonders of relatively high sequences. Indeed, killing a pirate admiral in a short period of time is too difficult, even if it's an assassination. Klein coughed twice and snapped his fingers. He stopped attacking and hesitating. He turned and ran for the window in the captain's cabin. The last thing he noticed was the diamond-inlaid bangle, but he didn't dare to retrieve it. Firstly, he was afraid that the severe negative effects would affect his escape, and secondly, he was afraid that Tracy would be able to lead a bunch of Beyonders to pursue him with the help of the item's location after she recovered. A pursuit at sea would then unfold. "I can't be greedy." Klein turned his head and smashed through the window and fell onto the deck. Two pirates happened to come over as they thrust their cutlasses forward. Oof! Oof! Their cutlasses pierced through a paper figurine. Klein's figure instantly appeared behind one of the pirates, as he extended his left hand, opening up a ferocious and creepy mouth on his palm. Creeping hunger bit down on its food, while Klein lifted the pirate up before other Beyonders rushed over. He took wide steps and ran to the shipboard. Under gunfire, he plunged into the dark sea under the night sky. Chapter 583. Contingency Plan. The ice-cold water instantly inundated Klein, drenching his golden-red dress and making him sink like a rock. At the same time, creeping hunger had already finished eating the pirate, lightening his load. Klein didn't attempt to float up and had instead continued sinking downwards. He could faintly hear splashing sounds across the distant waves. Apparently, pirates from the sailor pathway had engaged in pursuit. This was their home ground. They could act like fish in such environments for a very long period of time. Klein wasn't alarmed. As a magician who never performed unprepared, he had obviously thought of his escape plans if he met with failure. After all, there was nothing guaranteed about such matters. To do his best acting as Helene and not be discovered by Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy, he had not only left the other mystical items and cache above the grey fog, but he had even done so for the charms that came under the water and wind domain that he recently made. However, this didn't affect him. As a god, a blessed, and a believer trinity, he had many miraculous methods to deal with the corresponding situation. He quickly made creeping hunger turn pale and be dyed in a gloomy green. The surrounding seawater froze, forming layers of frost. Before the frost completely turned into ice, Klein spread his wing muscles and spread out his arms. With the strength of a zombie, he shattered the frost, sending them slightly further away. This way, he temporarily produced a narrow space that didn't have any seawater around him. The water instantly surged backwards to fill the space. Klein extended his left palm and released the terrifying cold and spread it out, creating layers of ice walls. For a brief moment, he seemed to be encased in an ice prison. He could stand in it and produce sound, but he was only limited to that tiny space. Klein immediately took tiny steps in a counterclockwise fashion while murmuring blessings stem from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth, before rapidly letting his spirit body go above the grey fog. Just as his body appeared at the fool's high-backed chair, he immediately picked up the sea god's scepter which he had placed on the table. Without needing to identify anything, he selected the point of light representing Gehrman Sparrow, who had recently been promoted to a believer of sea god. Through a previously established connection, he raised the short milky white scepter and made the bloob gems on it emit a blurry luster. He replied to his believer and augmented himself with all sorts of spells, including but not limited to underwater breathing, freedom of movement, and pressure resistance. Finally, he used a paper angel to interfere with any divination. He then ordered the nearby undersea creatures to help protect Gehrman Sparrow's escape. After doing all of this, Klein didn't delay and had immediately returned to the real world and gained control of his body. At that moment, the seawater's pressure had crushed the constantly melting ice wall and had retaken that independent space. However, Klein could already breathe easily and swim rapidly. Through the rippling but crystalline water, he saw fishes swimming towards him. A dark shadow rose up from beneath his feet as an unknown behemoth rapidly rose. It was a strange brownish-red creature that looked like a squid. It was so massive that its tentacles were enough to bind an entire ship. It spewed black ink and instantly dyed the surrounding sea black. The few sailor pathway beyonders who were pursuing Klein instantly saw black as their bodies turned numb. Unclear of what was happening, they immediately floated to the surface and dealt with the abnormalities in their bodies. By the time they dived down again to find the enemy, they had already lost track of Klein. At this moment, Klein was swimming at the bottom of the sea with great satisfaction. He even had the time to divert his attention to recall his failed operation and reflect on what he had done. I had sufficient preparations to act as Helene. Even Tracy, who had shared numerous nights with her on the same bed, couldn't instantly see through me. It accelerated the digestion of the potion. During this process, I still had to overcome my aversion and find a way to both get into character and be detached. This was extremely helpful to the digestion of the potion. I basically did the best I could for the battle. It can be considered a prepared performance, but I underestimated the strength of a Sequence 5 Demoness of Affliction and the experience of someone who inched her way to becoming Vice Admiral Aylment. Even though she lost her mystical item in the beginning, just my present strength and my mystical item weren't enough to kill her quickly, unless I had used the Sea God Scepter. But this is around the Rorstad Archipelago. Through today's battle, I can clearly tell that I lack a mystical item with powerful offensive abilities. Facing the reality of a failed mission, Klein was no doubt somewhat disappointed. However, he wasn't depressed, because this wasn't the end of this matter. He planned on writing to Mr. Azek to see if he was interested in the ancient chronicles related to death, and if he had the time to pay a visit. Before Klein left the captain's cabin, he had snapped his fingers to ignite the male clothing he had left in the changing room, as well as any hair or skin he had left behind. This was to make it seem like he didn't wish to leave any traces, but it was in fact a form of concealment and deceit. What he was concealing was the hair and button he had secretly thrown into a particular room without anyone noticing after he entered the cabin. Having wiped away any traces of himself, Vice Admiral Aylman Tracy would mistakenly believe that the assassin was afraid of exposing himself because of the fear of suffering a remote curse. Then, it would be difficult for her to seriously get the pirates to check for any remnant items. With the hair and button, Klein could use divination to lock onto the location of the Black Death up to a certain amount of time. This way, as long as Mr. Azek was willing, he could bring him to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Sigh. I originally thought I wouldn't need Mr. Azek's help. I thought I could succeed just by myself alone. Ultimately, I fell just short. Klein sighed and felt a blow to his self-esteem. This was one of the reasons why he didn't seek Mr. Azek's help in the beginning. The other reason was that he wasn't certain that Tracy was in possession of the ancient chronicles related to death. If she really didn't have it would be rather awkward to have Mr. Azek make a trip for nothing. Furthermore, he was worried that even with Mr. Azek's help, that he would still need to act as Helene to find the Black Death and Tracy. He still needed to wear her clothes and use himself as bait. That would be too embarrassing to do it in front of someone he knew. In fact, if it wasn't to obtain intelligence and solely to eliminate Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, it would have been a lot simpler. Once I swim back to Byam and go above the gray fog, I simply need to lock onto their location and use the Sea God Scepter to create a storm. This isn't to say that a huge area of attack blast will definitely kill Tracy on the spot, but it will attract Sea King John Cotman's attention. When the time comes, the Black Death's location would be exposed to the Church of Storms. Sea King will happily take down Ailment Maiden. Klein shook his head with self-deprecating mockery. With his seer's spiritual intuition guiding him, he rapidly swam towards the shore. On the Black Death, Tracy removed her layers of defense and walked to the diamond-inlaid bangle, in her damaged blood-stained clothes. She bent down to pick it up. What a cautious attacker. I might not even be comparable to her back when I was an assassin. No him. Tracy suddenly clenched her teeth. This wasn't because she nearly died at his hands, but because he had sensed that the man had done something to Helene. According to the way Emperor Roselle put it, she suspected that there was something green growing on her head. Helene, are you really that cold and heartless? No, perhaps she was forced. Tracy turned her head to look at the nasty wound on her left shoulder as she felt the heart-wrenching pain. If not for the strengthening of her physique brought about by the assassin and instigator sequence, with a significant enhancement in subsequent sequences, just that one blow alone could have made her lose her entire arm. She would be like those pirates who had their arms blown off by rifles. As the blood flowed and stained her vision red, Tracy got the blonde female attendant to enter and use her abilities to help her deal with her injuries while instructing the surrounding pirates who had their eyes fixated on her to search for any items the attacker had left behind. Unfortunately, the pirates informed her that all of his clothes had been automatically destroyed. This made Tracy recall the snap the enemy had made before he left. She sighed once again. How careful. Furthermore, he's not one bit greedy. If he had taken the bangle, then I wouldn't need to worry about not catching up to him. Tracy waved her hand, motioning for most of the pirates to leave, leaving behind Wormtongue Mither King and a few high-ranking members of the crew. Third mate, go to Byam again. Perform a thorough investigation to figure out where the resistance found that Helene, Tracy ordered in a solemn voice. With great difficulty, Mither retracted his gaze from his captain's chest. All right. Tracy thought for a moment and added, spread this matter. Say that I'm seriously injured and will not be able to recover any time soon. Also, first mate, immediately set sail. Don't stay here any longer. As she issued orders, silence was quickly restored around Tracy. Only at this point did she have the time to figure out which faction the attacker came from, why he would attack her, and what motives he had. Unfortunately, the more Tracy thought, the more puzzled she became. She had no idea what the truth was. Although she had many enemies, none of them possessed similar powers. Finally, she found a clue as she muttered to herself, creeping hunger. In the middle of the night, in a private harbor on Blue Mountain Island, standing by the receding and advancing waves was a female figure. She was none other than Klein, who was still disguised as Helene. He circled under the water and quickly came onto shore. He infiltrated the house of a nearby fisherman and got some tattered clothes to change into before changing back into Gairman Sparrow. Leaving behind the rather expensive dress as compensation, Klein rapidly left the private harbor and returned to the city of Generosity, Byam, before daybreak. He wasn't in a rush to meet up with Danitz. Instead, he found a random motel to stay in. He used a ritual and brought back Azek's copper whistle, other mystical items, and cash back to the real world. After confirming that he could divine the location of the Black Death, he blew the copper whistle. Chapter 584. Scapegoat. After lowering the copper whistle, Klein had already activated his spirit vision. He saw illusory white bones being weakly thrown up from the ground as they slowly formed a gigantic figure. If the past scenes were like a fountain in a fantasy setting, then this was more like the flow from an ordinary reverse tap. The corners of Klein's mouth moved indiscernibly as he pretended as though he hadn't noticed anything amiss. After a few seconds, the skeleton messenger finally took form. Its nearly 4 meters body tore through the ceiling once again as the pitch-black flames in its eye sockets burned silently. Klein folded the letter he had finished writing and threw it up. He described in detail the tycoon, Jimmy Necker, in the letter. He mentioned the connections between the death chronicles found in the southern continent's Balam Empire's mausoleum, as well as the connection the item had with Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos and Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. He also mentioned how he had successfully sneaked in, and although his assassination had failed, he had left behind something that could be used to determine the location of the Black Death. Of course, he didn't go into detail how he sneaked in. He had only roughly recounted Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's combat techniques and style. After the messenger caught the letter with a swipe that could send an adult human flying, Klein coughed and cleared his throat. I already have a messenger. The pitch-black flames in the skeleton messenger's sockets clearly flickered before its body collapsed like a waterfall before drilling into the parquet. You don't have to be afraid of becoming my messenger anymore, right? Am I that detestable to your kind? Yes. These messengers from the underworld probably can't bear to leave Mr. Azek. After all, that's a direct descendant of death. There might not even be any skip in the generational line. You want to cozy up with someone powerful. I get it. Klein was just about to pack up and check out when his nose itched suddenly and sneezed. Achoo! Achoo! Cough! 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 Mucus flowed out as he coughed. His forehead slowly but decisively began burning with heat. Oh no! Vice Admiral Ailment's ailment is still lingering in my body, and I confronted a 10 degrees Celsius cold wind in order to return to Biome. I really fell ill as a result. Klein used inferior tissue paper to wipe his mucus, contemplating whether to summon himself and act using a spirit body state, so that his physical body could heal by itself. After serious consideration, he believed that it was impossible. Firstly, his physical condition would clearly affect his spirit body's condition. The two were closely related in some magical manner. Secondly, if he ignored it, his physical condition would definitely worsen. I'm becoming a little dazed from the fever. Klein touched his forehead and prepared to return to the Wind of Azure Inn to meet up with Danitz. Then, he had to consider if he should head to a hospital or clinic to buy some medicine. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek finally obtained the Radiant Spirit-packed tree fruit from Mam Hermit, and he successfully concocted the Solar High Priest potion. It was golden in color and had a scorching hot temperature. When Derek drank it, he felt the burning sensation in his throat. His eyes lit up suddenly as they grew brighter like there were 2 miniature suns hidden in them. His body radiated concentric ripples of pure light as his exposed skin protruded to form black patterns that were visible to the naked eye. At the same time, his body hair grew longer, as though they were changing into feathers that were swirling with golden flames. Derek knew that there would be similar changes when consuming a potion at Sequence 7. He didn't panic or become flustered. He clenched his teeth and repeatedly recalled that pain of him personally killing his parents and the hope that arose from the depths of his heart after meeting Mr. Fool. Despite being on the brink of losing control, he managed to persevere through it. After a while, everything abnormal about him was restored back to normal. However, the air he exhaled was mixed with the warmth of the sun. He felt that his body had become stronger again, and he had some considerable resistance against ailments and treacherous environments. However, that wasn't the main point. Derek liked the various theurgical knowledge that appeared in his mind. They included Fire of Light, Horror Immunity, Holy Oath, Cleave of Purification, Sun Halo, Holy Light Summoning, Holy Water Creation, etc. Derek paced around in delight as he felt that the related theurgical spells he had were very suitable for him in dealing with the evil monsters that hid in the dark. He didn't hide the news and immediately ran to the Twin Towers and recorded the information of his advancement. This way, after a preliminary inspection, he would have the qualifications to helm a small patrolling team as its captain. He could come into contact with more of the City of Silver's information. This includes the method to removing the mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic, which Mr. World wants. While Derek was answering the registration clerk's various questions, he couldn't help but recall the promise that he hadn't been able to fulfill all this time. Owing something to others often left him uneasy and uncomfortable. And now, he could finally see the light that could restore his calm. In the Amiris Leaf Bar, Wormtongue Mythor King was holding a cup of red wine. He sat across from the elderly strongman Oziel, crossed his right leg, and leisurely asked, "Did you figure out anything specific?" He had been instructed by his captain, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, to return to Byam and investigate the fake Helene. For this, he found Oziel, who had originally issued the mission. He couldn't directly seek out the resistance, because there was a small chance that they were cooperating with the fake Helene. To question them in person was no different from directly bringing his head to the Governor General's office in exchange for the bounty reward. Oziel pulled a chair and sat down. "They didn't hide anything, but I can't be sure if they're speaking the truth or not. As you know, I prefer using fists rather than brains. They said that Helene was brought over by Blazing Danitz. He represented Vice Admiral Iceberg and hoped to establish a cooperative relationship with the resistance. They wanted to provide a certain amount of help, and Helene was a way to express their goodwill." Blazing Danitz? Vice Admiral Iceberg. Mythor ruminated over the two names as his expression slowly turned solemn. He leaned back into his chair as he knitted his brows bit by bit. As one of Vice Admiral Hurricane's former captains, he was now the third mate of Vice Admiral Ailment's flagship. He was no stranger to the other pirate admirals, and he knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg was powerful and had a rich collection. With just one ship and a few subordinates, she was able to resist the other pirate admirals. In terms of strength, she was a little stronger than two of his bosses. More pertinently, Vice Admiral Iceberg seldom involved herself in the conflict between pirates. She sought information and explored the unknown to seek out treasure. She was more like an adventurer than a pirate. Why would she suddenly want to assassinate Captain? This doesn't suit her character. She previously suffered a setback because of Admiral of Blood's rumors. She should be focusing on seeking revenge on him. Mythor took a sip of red wine as he rubbed his forehead with his other hand. He temporarily stopped thinking about Vice Admiral Iceberg, and he placed his attention on Blazing Danitz. As he carefully recalled, his pupils suddenly shrank. He discovered that there were some recent problems regarding this fourth bosun of the Golden Dream he was familiar with. He laid a trap and killed Steel Mavady, Blood Brambles Hendry, and Calm Squall. His bounty was raised to 4,200 pounds, and in a short period of time, he got embroiled in some matter, causing his bounty to rise again, reaching 5,500 pounds. "This has already exceeded my bounty," Mythor thought to himself silently as Blazing Danitz's figure surfaced before him. He found him mysterious and terrifying. He advanced. Or did he receive some great benefits because of something? Mythor leaned forward and put down the cup. He whispered seriously, "I originally treated his bounty increase as a joke. But reality has informed me that Blazing Danitz is a great pirate worthy of a 5,500-pound bounty." Mythor looked up and said to Strongman Oziel, "Help me seek out intel on Blazing. The recent ones." In the luxurious suite in the Wind of Azure Inn. When Danitz opened the door and saw Gehrman Sparrow, he glanced around warily before making way. "How was it? Did the hunt succeed?" he asked in excitement and curiosity after closing the door. "Vice Admiral Ailment is a famous beauty. Back when I saw her, she was even more charming than I imagined. What a pity if she were to just die like that. She should be locked up forever without parole. Pooey! How can she be prettier than Captain? Those with looks like her are plenty in the Red Theater." Contradictory thoughts ran through Danitz's head. Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth before coughing violently. After calming down, he answered coldly almost. "What a pity," Danitz sighed. But deep down, he was thinking, this madman, Gehrman Sparrow, is really strong. He infiltrated the Black Death to assassinate Vice Admiral Ailment but was only just fell short of success. Even though he failed, he successfully returned almost without any injuries. One had to know that the reason why every pirate admiral was famous throughout the 5 seas, being second only to the 4 kings, wasn't only because they themselves were strong. It was also because they represented a crew, a force to be reckoned with. They had many Beyonders under them. To be able to escape from the Black Death after a failed assassination had indicated that Gehrman Sparrow was in no way weaker than any pirate admiral. Is creeping hunger really that powerful? No, even if I were in his shoes and had creeping hunger, I wouldn't be able to go that far. Danitz was increasingly convinced that his choice of not resisting during his first encounter with Gehrman Sparrow was extremely wise. Klein coughed twice again and prepared to instruct Danitz to buy some medicine for him from the hospital. He then recalled that the cause of his illness was complicated. The medicine provided to him without a doctor's careful examination might not be effective. Even the many medicines that Emperor Roselle had previously invented were the same. If it wasn't because it's impossible to use the gray fog to establish a remote treating system, I really wish that I could consult Emlyn White to make me some medicine. Klein went to the washroom to wash up and change into his original clothes and burn the clothes he obtained from the fisherman. Upon seeing him come out, Danitz went over with a paper bag and said in a sycophantic manner, "This is the 700 pounds they gave." At this point, he and Klein heard someone knock on the door. It was Captain Elend. When the captain rushed into the room, he gave Gehrman Sparrow a deep look and suppressed his voice. "I planned on returning to Pritz Harbor, but I received a piece of intel. Something huge seemed to have happened at Bansi Harbor." Chapter 585. Buying medicine. The Church of Storms has finally taken action on Bansi Harbor? Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth before coughing. He asked calmly without any qualms, "What happened?" Ellen didn't notice any abnormal reaction from Gehrman Sparrow. He retracted his gaze and surveyed the area. "I don't know what exactly happened. I only know that it might have involved the upper echelons of the Church of Storms. And for a period of time before that, all routes that lead to Bansi Harbor were cancelled. This might have been a so-called omen." Involved the upper echelons of the Church of Storms? No, it should be the most elite forces. I suspect that the pontiff of the Church of Storms, that grounded angel, had personally taken action. He might have even used a Grade 0 sealed artifact. After all, he might be facing a king of angels, one that's even older than the fourth epoch, as well as his descendants. Klein nodded and calmly asked, "What's the outcome?" He wasn't the least bit surprised that the Church of Storms had only taken action on Bansi Harbor in the past few days. Even though the mandated punishers were known for being rash and irascible, there was still a protocol that needed to be followed for serious matters like this. For example, they needed to make a confirmation, evacuate a portion of innocent residents, or seal off the surrounding sea. All of this needed time. Elend was unable to read Gehrman Sparrow's true emotions as he sighed with a smile. There won't be a Bansi Harbor for a very long period of time. As expected of the Church of Storms. Klein secretly clicked his tongue, feeling even more curious about the detailed process. He wanted to know whether Red Angel Medici had appeared, and if he really was sleeping near Bansi Harbor. He wanted to know if he had been wiped out by the Church of Storms and wished to know what happened to the natives in Bansi Harbor. He wanted to know what it meant for them to speak in such a staccato manner, and he wished to know what secrets were hidden in the Green Lemon restaurant and the telegraph office. Unfortunately, with Bansi Harbor's destruction, it was difficult for him to obtain any actual answers. Perhaps the internal record of the Church of Storms would mention them, but Klein had no way of getting them. With the Hanged Man's rank, there was no way he could gain access to such confidential information. "I'll have to nurture Mr. Hanged Man into a high-sequence demigod before I can know the answers to my questions." Klein sighed silently and said without a change in expression, "That place is indeed very dangerous." Before he finished his sentence, his throat itched as he coughed violently. "You fell ill?" Elend asked, puzzled. He originally imagined that Gehrman Sparrow was like him, a Beyonder whose physique had been considerably enhanced. It was unlikely for Beyonders like them to fall ill before they grew weak from age. But from the looks of it, his previous guess might have been wrong. Klein answered tersely without giving an explanation. "A question of no value or meaning. It would be odd if he isn't ill after an intense battle with Ailment Maiden." Danitz grumbled in contempt from the side. Ellen chuckled and said, "I can recommend you an apothecary that's better than a hospital or clinic. That's his Beyonder job. He has a tiny herb store in the alley diagonally across Red Theater. He's known for selling male enhancements, but that's not what he's best at." "Does every apothecary develop such medicine?" "That's right. It's absolutely one of the most profitable medicine-based businesses. It's only odd not to do it if they're capable of doing it." Klein nodded slightly in response. "Why haven't I heard of him?" Danitz asked, surprised. "He only came to Byam in the past few months. When was your last visit here in the City of Generosity?" Elend asked with a chuckle. "When I took your crappy boat." Danitz answered silently in his mind. He carefully recalled and discovered that in the past few months, apart from this period of time, he had passed by Byam once during the early days of his vacation. At other times, he was drifting out at sea in search of treasure. Otherwise, he was at other places or harbors enjoying himself, so it was true that he wasn't aware of any minor changes in the City of Generosity. I've already spent quite a few days in Byam. I've been to the Red Theater several times, but I've not heard anything about this apothecary. This can only serve to imply that his male enhancement medicines are limited in effect. Danitz bragged as he said stubbornly. Ellen smiled and didn't debate with the great pirate. Instead, he said to Gehrman Sparrow, if it's only an ordinary ailment, the apothecary will only charge a slight premium. And for you, it doesn't matter if it's expensive. What's most important is to recover your health as quickly as possible. No adventurer wishes to stay in a sick state. This implies danger and that you might become the target of someone else. It implies the increased risk of losing control. Indeed, maintaining a good state is a rather important matter for Beyonders. However, the price is still very important, alright? If that apothecary were to charge £1,000, then I might as well buy medicine from the hospital. Or I can describe the situation of my illness and get that vampire, Emlyn White, to make me some medicine. Although I already have £6,000 in savings and have several Beyonder characteristics, I still need to consider it. I still want to add a mystical item with lethal offensive power and seek out clues to the high-sequence potion formula. Klein mumbled inwardly. High-sequence potion formulas were impossible to put a price on in this mysterious world. Therefore, Klein only thought of buying the relevant clues. After Elend left, Klein took the £700 and gave Danitz £200. Wearing his hat and holding his cane, he coughed and wiped his snot before stepping out the door in preparation to take a carriage to the vicinity of the Red Theater. Danitz was very curious about the apothecary's medicine. He pasted 2 mustaches on his face, wore a cap, and followed. With Klein's guidance, he already knew that using a scarf to hide his face was an act that strongly attracted attention in Byam. He took his advice to buy some fake mustaches. In the alley diagonally across the Red Theater, the moment Klein entered, he saw a man furtively come out of a nameless herb store. The moment the man saw someone, he hurriedly lowered his head and rushed off. Don't worry. We won't be guessing what medicine you're buying. Klein coughed twice again, increased his pace, and walked into the dark herb store. He scanned the area and was surprised because the boss was someone he knew. The boss was wearing a black robe that resembled a village witch doctor. He was in his 30s, with black hair and brown eyes. His face was round and his body chubby. He was none other than the chubby apothecary, who often liked to use sarcasm at the gathering held by old Mr. Eye of Wisdom in Backlund. Klein had once recognized him at a circus. He stopped showing up at old Mr. Eye of Wisdom's Beyonder gathering because he left Backlund. Klein coughed and took 2 steps forward. Make some medicine for me. On the chubby apothecary's shoulder stood a round-eyed owl. The man and the bird looked up at the same time at Klein. After a brief examination, the chubby apothecary revealed a warm smile. Friend, it's cold outside. Don't do those deeds out in the open, although it's true that it can be rather exciting. What the hell? Klein was first stumped before he understood what he was getting at. When batting Tracy, I was influenced by her pleasure powers. Blood flowed down to my nether regions, and my desires undulated. This resulted in my body emptying out, making it faster and easier for the ailment to strike me. When escaping, the ice-cold sea was fine since I had theurgical spells protecting me. But the wind on the way back was rather cold. It worsened my sickness. In conclusion, doesn't this look like getting sick as a result of having pleasure out in the open? As expected of an apothecary. He has sharp eyes. Klein maintained a composed expression and just looked at him without answering him. All he did was wait for him to concoct the medicine. Danitz turned his head to look out the herb store as he held back his laughter with great difficulty. What dog's hit apothecary is this? He can't even distinguish the ailments released by Ailment Maiden. He thought in glee. When the chubby apothecary didn't get a response, he dully opened some cabinets, took out some common or strange herbs and insect carapaces, stuffed them into a paper bag, and handed it over. Put it all in water and cook it for half an hour. Drink the liquid that's left over. 4 soli. It's a little expensive. Klein glanced at Danitz. The latter immediately took out the money automatically. As the chubby apothecary collected the money, he bent his back and suppressed his voice to say with a chuckle, I have medicine that can make you stand out in that area. The kind that has mummy powder added. Need it? I guarantee you that you'll be satisfied. I know you might be very strong, but men always seek to be stronger. Firstly, I need to have a girlfriend. Klein coldly shook his head and rejected the chubby apothecary's recommendation. The chubby apothecary straightened his back in disappointment. He turned his gaze and sized up the two before asking, "Are the both of you adventurers?" "Yes," Klein answered simply. The chubby apothecary rubbed his hands and said, "I have a request, but you'll only be paid after completing it." "How big is the reward?" Klein pinched his nose. £100. The chubby apothecary shouted as his heart pained for the money. "Help me find someone. His name is Roy King. He's my teacher. He got me to meet him here, but I haven't seen him after waiting for months. And I have no way of contacting him. Is there a portrait, or a photograph?" Klein inquired. The chubby apothecary took out a photograph from a secret pouch by his waist and handed it over. It was of a relatively young man. His hair was neatly combed back and he wore glasses. He appeared very gentlemanly. "Your teacher?" Klein asked. "I might believe it if you're the teacher." The chubby apothecary coughed dryly and said, "He's at least 60, but he looks young. A beyonder power or a mystical item?" Klein nodded in thought and began asking about the specifics. After confirming that there weren't any items he could use to divine, he took the paper bag and left the store. After he disappeared from the alley, the owl standing on the chubby apothecary's shoulder suddenly said, "Dark Will, that guy might know you." Chapter 586. Farewell and goodbye. What? He knows me? The chubby apothecary, Dark Will, was alarmed as he whispered back. The owl's round eyes looked ahead and said, "I noticed that he clearly paused for 2 seconds the moment he saw you when he came in. Perhaps he thinks someone like me doesn't match his image of an apothecary," the chubby apothecary retorted. The owl spread its wings and landed. "Suit yourself if you wish to think so. What books have you been reading recently?" The fat on the chubby apothecary's face trembled. The owl replied sternly and seriously, "My reading is based on your knowledge standards such as those involving soccer. Unfortunately, the words you grasp and can teach me are limited. I have no choice but to read popular novels that have a lower requirement on one's vocabulary. Besides, they're all serialized on the newspaper." Dark Will chuckled. "I'll buy a recipe cookbook later. It's called Guide to East Balam Bird Culinary Methods." Without waiting for the owl to answer, his expression sank and he muttered to himself, "He knows me? He looks like the standard Loanese man. More than half his blood is at least Lone. I used a fake name to stay in a few cities in Lone. It's not odd to be recognized by him, but I still need to be on guard. If I don't receive any news about Old Man before March, then I have to leave this place." Having said that, he turned his head to look at the owl who was perched on his shoulder. "At times, you're still rather useful. No, your eyes and your body language tells me that your real thoughts are, darn it. I wanted to buy a pet that can help me beat monsters and gangsters. I sought out beyonder ingredients of a potion recipe according to the standards of a dragon, but I ended up getting a silly bird who only knows how to read newspapers and plays. Darn it. I want to stuff another potion down its throat." The owl repeated like a parrot by mimicking the chubby apothecary's tone. Darkwill's expression stiffened for a few seconds before he chuckled. "It's good that you know this, silly bird. If I didn't have the powers of a beast tamer, you wouldn't have even managed a single potion." Inside the herb store, the man and bird fell into silence. After a while, the owl pretended as though nothing had happened as it asked, "Dark Will, is it really going to work? You've already entrusted this to dozens of adventurers. I'm not good at finding people, so I can only entrust it to someone else. Besides, they have to find and confirm Old Man's location before I make a payment. I don't even need to spend a single penny." The chubby apothecary sked as he said before he sighed. "Old Man always calls himself a lucky person and a winner of fate. He should be fine. Will the medicine brewed from this really be effective?" While returning to the Wind of Azure in via carriage, Danitz looked at the paper bag beside Klein. The things inside were black herbs, strangely shaped insect carapaces, and weirdly colored flowers. It didn't seem like anything reliable. Klein nodded. "Yes. You haven't drunk it," Danitz subconsciously retorted. "I trust him. Although his mouth stinks and is rather vile, He has a rather kind heart. Besides, Captain Elend believes that his medicine is sufficiently effective. As Gehrman's sparrow, Klein didn't respond to Danet's doubts. He directly picked up the paper bag and threw it over. Without needing any spoken words, Danetz knew what he meant. He was in charge of brewing the medicine. Furthermore, he was accustomed to doing similar matters recently, so he didn't have any urges to resist. After returning to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein got a chair to sit in while he watched Danetz light up the fireplace and prop up a pot. He then added water and the herbs into it. Leaning back, Klein felt his head feel groggy. He was very exhausted and felt like he could fall asleep at any moment. In order to wait for the medicine to finish brewing and for him to quickly resolve his illness, he forced himself to consider various problems to combat the fatigue. On careful consideration, during the battle with Vice Admiral Ailment, if I hadn't succeeded in sneaking in an attack on her and suppressing her from the very beginning, preventing her from getting into her rhythm until she eventually found a chance to force open a gap between us by turning invisible, then I might have not been her match. The two powers of invisibility and ailments are really like a bug in a game. Matched with an assassin's lethal strike, and the interference of pleasure, it really makes one unable to find and hit her or escape. One can only watch their body gradually weaken and become inflicted with all sorts of ailments. One can even get mesmerized and give up resisting. On the one hand, it's because every sequence 5 is very powerful, as expected of the sequence just before a demigod. On the other hand, it's because Creeping Hunger's various powers aren't a good match. It cannot be considered to be multifaceted without any weaknesses. Yes. The powers of a Sequence 5 Nimble Right Master of the Seer Pathway is highly effective against invisibility. I can try to help the chubby apothecary find his teacher in the meantime, but without any information, with just a picture, I can only try my luck. I'll have to see when I can directly find a clue. After all, I'm not a god, and I can't find people remotely. Wait, in a certain way I am a god. I can get sea god believers to help find him. As long as that old gentleman named Roy King once visited Byam, he would have definitely encountered others and be seen by them. Most native residents secretly believe in sea god. This is what it means by a sea of people. Also, before Captain Elend leaves Byam, I should get him to introduce me to a point of contact for the military. In the future, I can get him to reimburse me for any intel. They can also check if there were any travelers named Roy King, who registered on any liners in recent months. There's another method. I've placed the radio transceiver above the gray fog for some time. I should be able to contact the magic mirror, Arrodes, if I take it down. I was originally planning on asking for Helene's location, but I no longer need to find the red-haired lady anymore. I can switch to Roy King. For a matter which many adventurers have no clue on how to begin, I have 3 solutions. Amidst his thoughts, Klein finally held on until the medicine was successfully brewed. Looking at the bottle of blackish-green liquid that Danetz brought over, he hesitated for 2 seconds before extending his hand to receive it and placed it to his mouth. Gulp. Klein immediately felt his throat burn as his face flushed red. This made him recall his attempt at eating crazy spicy food in his previous life. Suddenly, his entire person awakened as his stuffy nose quickly cleared. Gulp. Gulp. He barely finished drinking it and felt as though he had nearly recovered from his sickness. By night time, he had fully recovered. He no longer showed any doubt towards an apothecary's abilities. No wonder the potion's name is Apothecary Klein wore his hat and left the inn with Danetz. Under the cloak of night, they left Byam and came to a secret harbor hidden on the other end of the jungle. Tonight, the Golden Dream was providing aid to the resistance. After some coordination and hassle, Danetz used the Soulfall ritual to contact Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. After some time, the ship that was often scrubbed clean and had a strange main cannon, docked by the private harbor. Its gigantic sails drew 5 types of gold coins. They were the gold pound of Lone, the gold horn of Faysac, the Virl gold of Intis, the gold rizet of Fainapotter, and the Sasson gold of Lenberg. This was the flag of the Golden Dream. It was also the symbol of this pirate crew. It's still not professional enough. If it were me, I would add Porter gold from Mason, Zloty from Seeger, motif gold coins from Balam Empire, etc. Klein stood by the side with his hands in his pocket as he watched Edwina Edwards appear at the bow. At that moment, she was wearing a hunter's hat, a rider's shirt, and a black coat. She matched the image of a female pirate admiral in the minds of the resistance. She often dresses like she's a private tutor. Klein mumbled and took a few steps back, allowing Danetz to run around and busy himself. This pirate worth 5,500 pounds did the liaison, sending a batch of food and fabric to Kalot and the resistance before the transaction came to a close. Danet secretly inhaled and came to Klein's side and forced a smile. There's nothing else, right? I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Also, how do you plan on settling the hiring fee? That's only an excuse your captain and I used. In a particular sense, this batch of food and fabric is my payment. Klein nodded. Your captain has already paid. You can return. For real? Danitz found it unbelievable. Although Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina wasn't far behind him, he was still afraid that Gehrman Sparrow would suddenly have a crazy fit. Klein didn't reply and turned around, walking straight towards the path that led out of the private harbor. Danitz exhaled silently and held back his excited feelings before briskly running back to the Golden Dream. Only when the Golden Dream steered far away into the night, with the private harbor that belonged to the Resistance slowly shrinking in size, did he really believe that he was back on the Golden Dream. At that instant, he felt that he had experienced just too many things over the past half a month or so. It was an unprecedented level of exhilaration, as though it was an interesting dream. At this moment, a sailor came close and asked out of curiosity, "Boss, was Steele Mavady really killed by you?" Danitz immediately laughed out loud and secretly stole a glance at Captain Edwina before saying to his subordinate, "I contributed greatly to this deed. Let's talk over drinks." Above the dark sea, the Golden Dream drifted off into the distance. After returning to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein was just about to sleep when he saw the surrounding colors turn abnormally bright. The white bed sheets turned whiter, and the brown floorboards turned more brownish yellow. The dark red curtains appeared like fresh blood. In the scene with all sorts of colors stacked upon each other, Isaac Eggers suddenly walked out from a rippling aqueous void. He was dressed in his usual shirt, bow tie, tailcoat, and a top hat. His skin was bronze in color, and he had soft facial features. How enviable! I also wish to have such powers of traveling through the spirit world. Klein silently sighed as he smiled in greeting while maintaining his appearance. Good evening, Mr. Isaac. Isaac took off his top hat and looked at the rather unfamiliar face. Without finding it strange, he chuckled. Apologies. I came in a hurry. I should have knocked on the door. What's the exact situation with those death chronicles? Klein invited him to have a seat. He then described in detail things he couldn't explain in the letter. Towards the end, he mentioned in passing about the matter regarding Bansi Harbor, saying how it involved King of Angels Medici and his descendants. Isaac leaned back into the chair and said with a frown, "There's such a name in my memories. He should have the two titles of Red Angel and War Angel. However, he had perished long ago." Perished long ago? Klein asked in surprise. Isaac nodded and thought over it. I remember that he was killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor? Klein's pupils shrank as he recalled the evil spirit that loitered in the underground ruins beneath Backlund. It had claimed to be an innocent killed by the Blood Emperor. Chapter 587. Confusing could it be that evil spirit is Red Angel Medici, the King of Angels who once served that creator and was one of the founders of Rose Redemption? Klein instantly generated such a thought and began utilizing backward inference to seek out any traces or clues. The former holder of the Red Priest card was attracted to the underground palace because of a certain level of attraction and had died beside the Tudor descendants. The evil spirit I saw in my dream could easily kill a powerful dragon back when it was alive. It knows the potion formula of the Mutant Pathways Sequence 4 and even more. It's very aware of matters regarding Rose Redemption. The Orthodox churches that have existed ever since the Cataclysm don't know that the former Binzi and that the present Bansi has a descendant of the Medici family residing there. But the evil spirit was able to provide the corresponding information. There's a very high chance of deriving this from the death of Red Angel Medici. And this King of Angels was actually killed by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Does this mean that the latter had already exceeded Sequence 1 and had reached the rank of True God as a Sequence 0, and could no longer be witnessed directly? That evil spirit said so itself that in the late stages of the Fourth Epoch, Solomon Empire's Dark Emperor, Tudor Empire's Blood Emperor, and Trunsoist Empire's Night Emperor were fighting for the position of Sequence 0 until Alista Tudor went crazy. Does this mean that from that point onwards, Blood Emperor was a half-crazy True God? Right. Mr. Isaac mentioned in the letter that he lost his senses from merely being glanced at by Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Back then, he was at least a Sequence 4 demigod. To have such might, it can only be explained that Blood Emperor was at the True God level. Mr. Azek also described the revival of the true Dark Emperor in his letter. He described him as sitting on a gigantic throne as he overlooked the land. For the Dark Emperor to revive and return, there is a high chance that he was a true god at the Sequence 0 rank. If that were the case, the War of the Four Emperors was of a higher order than I previously imagined. It's no longer a battle of 3 Sequence 1s fighting for the position of Sequence 0. Klein connected all the dots from the past, gaining a brand new understanding of Fourth Epic history. But as a result, many questions arose. If that ancient evil spirit really is King of Angels Medici, then the underground palace might very well belong to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. Then, why would there be 2 thrones of equal standing? Why would there be 6 humanoid statues of the true gods? Why would the half-crazy Blood Emperor kill Red Angel Medici? After he became Sequence 0, which spot did he occupy? Firstly, Dark Emperor can be eliminated. It can't be Red Priest, right? Red Angel Medici was killed for its Beyonder characteristic. But Red Priest and Dark Emperor do not seem like neighboring pathways that allow exchanging. I can basically confirm that the former is paired with the Demonis pathway. Yes. Captain mentioned before that consuming the potions of other pathways might not mean death, but there's a high probability of going mad and obtaining warped but terrifying powers. This matches Blood Emperor's half-crazy trait. In his final step, as there was no hope for Dark Emperor in any neighboring pathways, he took the craziest choice and switched to another pathway that's completely unrelated, becoming half-crazy as the price? But the same problem arises. Advancing to Red Priest requires King of Angels Medici to be killed, but before advancing, Alista Tudor wouldn't have been able to complete it by himself. Unless he had more Sequence 1s helping him or other Sequence 0 true gods. Upon realizing this, the statues in the underground palace suddenly flashed past Klein's mind. The Evernight Goddess statue who used the moon as a pillow, the Earth Mother statue that hugged a baby in her bosom, the Lord of Storms statue that had lightning flashing behind him, the handsome Eternal Blazing Sun statue, the tall and royal God of Combat statue, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom statue who wore a hood all cast ice-cold gazes at him from the darkness. At that instant, Klein couldn't help but tremble. However, he remembered that the 6 gods supported the Trunsoist Empire, not the Tudor Empire. The history of the Fourth Epic becomes more harrowing and confusing the more you delve into it. Klein sighed secretly. What are you thinking about? Azek Eggers noticed his pause. Klein said in passing, I was only thinking that since Red Angel Medici had long perished at the hands of Alista Tudor, then who is the god of weather who has a following in Bansi Harbor during the recent centuries? And what's the reason for their odd behavior? With this in mind, Klein came to a pause. This was because the matter regarding Bansi Harbor was unlike what he imagined. He originally believed that Red Angel Medici was asleep there, but to his surprise, he had long perished. In that case, the secrets underlying the Green Lemon restaurant and the telegraph office became even more indecipherable. He had no way of deducing anything without any further information. The more he thought about it, the more horrified he became. Could that evil spirit have expected such an outcome when he indicated Binzi Town? That might have been a required step for him to escape the seal? Should I tell this matter to Mr. Azek and gain his opinion? Yes, I'll let Miss Magician, who's in Backlund, to monitor the area and see if there's any abnormalities. If there's none, it can wait till I return to Backlund and contact Miss Sharon. After seeking her opinion, I can inform Mr. Azek. After all, it's a ruin we explored together. I have to respect her opinion. If there are any abnormalities, then the matter can only be expedited due to the seriousness of the issue. Klein quickly made a decision. When Azek heard his question, he laughed. Don't think about such matters. They've definitely been buried by the Church of Storms. To forcibly seek out the reasons will only bring about extreme danger. Even at the level of an angel, there's still a chance of perishing. In the mysterious world, curiosity is often the leading cause of death. Klein recalled the matters he had experienced and heard of in the past. He switched to saying, Mr. Azek, I already have a messenger that I can call my own. Much faster than I imagined, Azek said with a smile. Klein simply explained how he changed the incantation and how he completed the summoning and ended up encountering an oddity in the spirit world. When summoning spirit world creatures, there's indeed a chance of such things happening when it's not done by someone of the corresponding job. It requires repeated trial and error before obtaining the desired result. But repeated attempts make it easy to encounter danger. Even if you add descriptions like friendly, it isn't absolutely safe. The spirit world creature which is summoned might not have any malicious intent towards you and wouldn't wish to harm you. But it doesn't mean that its very existence won't hurt you. Perhaps just the aura it has can reduce you to a pile of blood. After Isaac heard about the creature whose speed surpassed imagination, the being who was easily neglected, and the creature with extremely high survivability, he laughed and warned him. After that, he asked, "How did you succeed in the end?" Klein said in embarrassment, "I changed the final sentence to a unique being that is willing to be my messenger." Isaac was taken aback for a second as he curiously looked at Klein. This description is too generic. Typically, it wouldn't succeed. Perhaps I was rather lucky. Klein cautiously described his messenger's appearance and even hid the matter of her request for a gold coin. Isaac thought over it carefully and said, "I do not have an impression of this spirit world creature, but since you've already signed a contract and have had it witnessed by the underworld, she likely wouldn't cause you any harm. However, before you fully understand her, try not to get her to do anything apart from sending letters." All right. Klein originally wanted to say that he had nothing he needed her for other than sending letters when he recalled his battle with Mr. A. The room fell into a brief moment of silence before Klein pulled the conversation back on track. "Mr. Isaac, when can we head for the Black Death?" The longer the delay, the higher the chances of whatever he left on the Black Death to be cleaned up during the daily cleaning jobs. Now. Isaac stood up and put on his hat. Klein was dressed properly, and just as he was trying to find an excuse to head to the washroom to divine if there would be any danger taking action tonight, Isaac grabbed his shoulder and pulled him into the spirit world. Amidst the stacked colors and nearly formless figures, he heard Mr. Isaac say, "Let's begin." That direct? Don't you need to confirm things? Perhaps a big shot has his own way of determining the level of danger. Klein silently mumbled and held up his cane and began divining the location of the items he left behind. The cane flew automatically as it tumbled ahead. Isaac followed closely behind with Klein in tow as they smoothly passed through the spirit world. Before long, the black hardwood cane paused with thick black and stacked shadows ahead of it. Through this abstract scene, Klein could vaguely identify it as something resembling the Black Death. At this moment, Isaac's body came to a pause as he solemnly said, "The spirits here tell me that there is danger." There is danger? Something that can make even Mr. Isaac find it dangerous? Vice Admiral Ailment got help? A high-ranking member of the Demonist sect? Klein frowned suddenly. He fully believed the judgment of the big shot, since Sequence 7 of the Death Pathway was Spirit Medium. After advancing to the realm of Demigod, being able to notice this was considered very normal. Isaac half closed his eyes for 2 seconds before opening them. But the problem isn't serious. Let's enter. Problem isn't serious. That's probably the case when it's directed at you. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he decided to change his looks. This way, even if he was no match and had to flee pathetically, he didn't have to be afraid of someone coming to knock on his door. In an instant, Klein possessed a distinctive broad chin and cold blackish-green eyes. His hair turned brown and was tied into a bun at the back of his head like an ancient warrior. He had disguised himself as the former owner of Creeping Hunger, Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Isaac gave him a glance as the surroundings suddenly seemed to plummet as all sorts of bright colors flew by. In a blink of an eye, Klein found himself in Ailment Maiden Tracy's captain's cabin again. This gallant and brilliant female pirate was wearing a different white shirt. On her left shoulder was a clear bandage while her black hair was coiled up instead of cascading down amorously. Faced with this sudden visitor, she didn't show any panic but smiled. At this moment, a gentle female's voice from a difficult-to-identify location sounded. "It's you?" Chapter 588. Old Acquaintance, it's you? Upon hearing this surprised and curious female voice, Klein jumped in fright, imagining that he had been recognized by someone. He immediately composed himself because he had already changed his appearance to that of the deceased Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. And inside Kalangos was the crazy adventurer, Gairman Sherlock. And inside Gairman Sparrow was the identity of the great detective, Sherlock Moriarty. And inside Sherlock Moriarty was the identity of Klein Moretti. This wasn't the end. Deep within Klein Moretti was Mr. Fool, Zhou Mingrue. There's no reason that she can directly see my true essence. Besides, how can she know of a trivial character like Klein Moretti? Even Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos wouldn't have left the Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's helper surprised. To be specially invited by a Sequence 5 pirate admiral to protect herself and deal with her enemy, The person must be at least a Sequence 4 demigod. Therefore, that sentence was directed at Mr. Azek? That high-ranking demoness recognizes Mr. Azek, who had destroyed their cooperation with the royal family and in Sanguil Backlund, or does she recognizes him from one of his former lives? Klein quickly cleared his train of thoughts and remained guarded against Tracy and her helper's sudden attacks. He also looked through the corner of his eye to observe Mr. Azek's reaction. He wasn't too surprised that a mysterious powerhouse would appear. Firstly, this was because Mr. Azek had already given a warning, and secondly, it was because he believed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wasn't a self-conceited person. To almost be assassinated without knowing the assassin's backing faction and motive, there was a high probability that she would leave the sea around the Rorstad archipelago to seek help from the upper echelons of the Demonist sect. The only thing hadn't expected was that her helper would arrive so quickly. It was as though she was nearby or had a mystical item like that of a traveler. Combining the female characteristics of the voice and the gentleness within it, Klein suspected that it was a demoness at the demigod level. Azek stood on the thick carpet and said after 2 seconds of hesitation, "You know me?" This tone sounds uncertain. Could it be that my big shot had once spent a period of time with a demoness? No, I can't think of it that way. Klein began to imagine things before he seriously felt penitent for having those thoughts. He noticed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wore an aghast look. Her certainty and calm had turned into puzzlement. The gentle female voice sounded out from an unknown location again. "I obviously know you. You should also know me." Azek turned his ears to the side to listen before he shook his head and gave a rueful smile. "I'm sorry. I've repeatedly lost my memories and am in the midst of recovering them. If you can remind me and invoke more of my memories, I'll be very grateful to you." Upon hearing their conversation, Tracy's puzzled and confused look settled. She cautiously swept her gaze at Klein but frowned when she saw Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos's face. The gentle female voice sighed. "The last time we met was 1,300 years ago. Back then, Primordial and Death were working together, instigating the Pale disaster in the northern continent. You might have already forgotten that we once fought the saints and angels of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. I know this piece of history. It was recorded in Emperor Rosel's diary. Mr. Dorr said that it resulted in the primordial demoness being heavily injured, and she had only managed to descend only in recent times. As for Death, he directly perished and created the Berserk Sea that separated the northern and southern continents. The Demonist sect and the forces of Death had previously cooperated, so it's no wonder that a demigod-ranked Demoness knows Mr. Azek. Man, she's also a monster that has lived for at least 1,400 years. Klein thought with a creative mind. Following that, he felt puzzled again. He originally imagined that Mr. Azek had suffered heavy injuries from being glanced at Blood Emperor Alista Tudor during the War of the Four Emperors, which resulted in him constantly losing his memory and forgetting his past. However, what the demigod-ranked Demoness indicated was that not only did Azek survive the War of the Four Emperors, but he had even participated in the Pale disaster many years later. He didn't seem to have any problems in between. Azek closed his eyes as though he was trying to squeeze out his memories. After a few seconds, he asked hesitantly, "Katerina Pell? You are already a Demoness of Unaging? I'm very happy that you can still remember me. I could only be considered a weakling compared to you back then." A figure outlined itself beside Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. She wore a simple and pure white gown which had high slits that revealed her flawless legs. Her skin was as white as snow and as tender as a young maiden's. The woman had black hair and blue eyes, and she looked elegant and pretty. She had an indescribable charm. She looked towards Azek Eggers as a faint smile curled at the corner of her lips. "More than 1,000 years have passed. It's a cause for celebration for us to meet, alive." Balam Empire's Mr. Death Consul. Mr. Azek was Balam Empire's Death Consul. This is the name of a later potion in the Death Pathway? This Demoness of Unaging Katerina Pell looks like she's in her 30s. She's elegant and pure, yet she exudes a mature charm. Wait, why am I thinking of this? Her pleasure charms are already that potent? Katerina hurriedly moved his gaze away and nearly had to use cogitation to calm his emotions. Without waiting for Azek to say a word, Katerina Pell said with a melodic voice, "I'm curious over why you would still be constantly losing your memories. I remember that it only happens for your pathway during the undying stage. Dying once every 60 years to revive again and forget the past. However, you have long advanced past that and escaped from that curse. What happened to you at the end of the Pale disaster?" "Heh. The 7 gods had fractured back then and treated each other as enemies. We both believed that Primordial and Death would succeed, but who knew that the proudest son and the most arrogant tyrant would bow their heads? They quickly joined forces again. If I hadn't managed to advance by chance, then I might have already perished at the end of that divine battle. I believe you should have suffered some damage which resulted in your present state. Death's perishing is itself the greatest injury for you. Isaac fell silent as he wore an indistinct painful expression. I can't remember. At this moment, Klein realized that Katerina Pell looked somewhat familiar, and he suspected her of being the white-robed lady who had led Madame Sharon onto the path of a demoness. Suddenly, Katerina's eyes turned to sweep a glance at Klein. She chuckled at Isaac and said, "I believe you haven't forgotten the reason for visiting today? I'm very curious why he would assassinate Tracy. Could it be for justice?" The glance the demoness of unaging swept over was filled with hidden amorousness and sweet playfulness. She resembled an underage young maiden, and her facial features and bearing had magically accentuated that feeling. She didn't have the jarring feeling of a mature lady acting young at all. At that moment, Klein viewed her as a maiden who was 16 or 17. She can already perfectly present every charm a woman can bring. She has the skin, facial features, and bearing to match it. As expected of a demoness of unaging, Klein had already attempted to use cogitation to resist this indescribable charm. He took the initiative to look at ailment maiden Tracy. "Do you know the tycoon named Jimmy Necker?" Tracy gaped her mouth before closing it again. She replied blankly and aggrieved. "Who is he?" "You might not know him. He once collected a batch of ancient chronicles related to death. He died at the hands of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos," Klein said while bearing the appearance of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Tracy narrowed her eyes. She wore a dazed look before turning angry. "You came for those documents? It really is in your hands?" Klein determined based on her tone. He answered indifferently. "That's right." Tracy inhaled slightly and said, "Where's Helene? Did you do anything to her? I know she's still alive. If something happens to her, my spiritual intuition will tell me." Klein didn't attempt to speak ambiguously as he directly answered her. "She has already returned to Intis to lead a brand new life." Tracy's expression sank. A storm raged in her eyes as the aura of a pirate admiral fully revealed itself. However, Isaac casually swept his gaze over and instantly made her calm down. The corners of her lips curled up. "That batch of documents from the mausoleum of the Balam Empire's royalty is indeed in my hands. But I wasn't interested in it. I flipped through it casually before handing it to the sect. Hee, even if you had succeeded in assassinating me, you wouldn't have received it. I didn't read it much, so even if you channeled my spirit, I wouldn't be able to reproduce it. Unfortunately, I can't bear to part with my life. Otherwise, it definitely would have been interesting to see your disappointment." Klein calmly said, "No, I won't be disappointed. I can obtain the soul and characteristic of a demoness of affliction. I can graze you and subdue you." As he spoke, he raised his left palm which had creeping hunger on it. It was in the shape of a black glove. Tracy narrowed her eyes. The look in her eyes became extremely dangerous, like a provoked tiger. If not for the 2 high sequence beyonders beside her, she might have already attacked. And the moment Klein finished his sentence, he noticed something amiss. "I'm not acting as Gehrman's sparrow at the moment, so why am I speaking in accordance with his persona?" Klein was alarmed as he suspected whether he had been too into character recently. "Remember, you can only be yourself. I cannot be influenced by the character I act as, because of prolonged acting. This will cause me to become lost and result in losing control." He quickly reflected on himself and added his conclusions into the acting principles of a faceless. Noticing his brief silence, Isaac looked at Katerina Pell and said in his usual tone, "Can you copy a set of those documents for me?" "That's not a big problem." Katerina gave Tracy a glance. "Any requests?" Tracy stared at Klein and said with a clearly hoarse voice, "Tell me where Helene is." Klein withdrew his thoughts and looked at her before looking at the pure demoness of unaging, Katerina. He had already made his decision, but he couldn't help but feel hesitant. He turned to look at Mr. Isaac and discovered his warm smile. He wasn't urging him or forcing him. Klein retracted his gaze and simply said, "I refuse." Chapter 589. Sowing discord. For an instant, Klein imagined that Tracy would directly attack him, as her face was already flushing red with anger. Her blue eyes had turned dark like the surface of a sea before an impending storm. But eventually, Tracy didn't act rashly. She looked towards Katerina Pell and awaited the decision of the demoness of unaging. She knew very well that, although Sequence 5 and Sequence 4 were just separated by one level, there was a qualitative difference between them. There was no way to bridge the gap with one's battle skills or execution. One was a normal human with special powers, while the other was already a demigod, a legendary creature possessing godhood. Furthermore, the two present were clearly not Sequence 4. Placed before them, Tracy felt like she was a low sequence beyonder. Katerina Pell didn't seem furious. She looked at Klein, who wore the face of Kalangos, and chuckled as her eyes moved across him. What an interesting lad. If not for Mr. Death Consul being here, I might have not revealed the upheavals within my heart and have an unexpected encounter with you which would lead into having a pure and romantic story with you. No, you don't want to. This sounds really terrifying. Klein didn't dare look at her as he continued looking at Tracy. Seeing no response from Isaac Eggers, Katerina retracted her gaze and said to Tracy with her melodious voice, "Embrace the afflicted pain. This might be something beneficial for you." She then looked towards Isaac. "I remember that batch of documents. It records the various attempts used by the Balam royalty to revive death, but unfortunately, they seem to fail miserably. Towards the end, they seem to consider creating an artificial death. Are you still interested? An artificial death? How can death be artificial? Apart from the uniqueness and beyonder characteristics, how can there be other methods? It's not like it's something you can find on the street. Was the former Balam Empire and the present numinous episcopate all crazy?" Klein mumbled silently and didn't interrupt the conversation between the demigods. Isaac pondered for 2 seconds before asking, "What price do I need to pay?" Katerina smiled youthfully. "No, there's no need. I thought it over. Helping you regain your memories and find your past in order to become the Death Consul from before should be a rather interesting matter. This can bring more changes and fun to this world." Those words sound like a rebellious teenage girl. A demoness of unaging not only doesn't age in body but in mind as well? Klein felt it somewhat impossible to grasp her thought process. Perhaps only a Sequence 6 or 5, or even Sequence 4 of the spectator pathway can tell. He subconsciously guessed. Isaac nodded and extended his right hand. A piece of paper and a fountain pen in the room automatically flew over as though invisible spirits were at his service. After scribbling, he threw the paper over. "You can summon my messenger. So there's only one copper whistle. For it to remain effective for more than 1,000 years, that copper whistle is definitely no simple item." Klein instinctively wished to reach out to touch Isaac's copper whistle inside his pocket, but he held back. Katerina caught the piece of paper and scanned it before pursing her lips into a smile. "I thought you would have directly told me where in the underworld." She looked up as her blue eyes effused an indescribable warmth as she smiled faintly. "I still remember how Mr. Death Consul from before was such a powerful but cold man. He left a deep impression on me. I'm also curious as to why you would become so soft." Isaac held his fist to his mouth and shook his head with a bitter smile. "I'm immortal, but that doesn't mean I don't age. Once a person ages, they will often become placid." "No." Katerina's eyes flickered deep down as she said without concealing anything, "I look forward to the day you recover all your memories. I wish to see how you would evaluate the present you." Upon saying that, she curled her lips slightly and winked at Klein. "Perhaps we will release an existence more evil than a devil." This is her trying to sow discord, right? Klein muttered inwardly, but he couldn't help but recall the Pale disaster recorded in many historical books and church tomes. It had caused a large number of casualties and had turned the northern continent into a living hell. And this disaster was mainly led by Death and the primordial demoness, with Death's entourage and the demoness sect from the southern continent. In this entire matter, Mr. Isaac, who was known as Death Consul, definitely played a rather important role. Isaac fell silent for a few seconds as he grabbed Klein's shoulder and pulled him into the spirit world and traversed it. Instantly, there was only demoness of unaging Katerina Pell and Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy left in the Black Death's captain's cabin. The latter looked at the spot where the two had disappeared, and after taking a while to calm herself, she clenched her teeth and said, "I'll never forget this matter." Katerina resumed her pure demeanor and smiled faintly. "Feel the afflicted pain. The more pain you feel, the more you will realize how weak you are. When the pain reaches a threshold, the desire to change yourself will reach a certain intensity, allowing you to withstand the potion and obtain godhood during the ritual to become a demigod. When Tracy heard this, she suddenly thought of something. Her expression froze as she blurted out, "Helene was able to escape the Black Death because of..." Katerina smiled mildly. "You are my youngest child, but you are the one who's most promising at becoming a demigod. As a mother, I will naturally want to help you." Tracy's facial muscles twitched as she said with a warped expression, "That's right. I have a mother like you, and a mom. Why didn't you tell me the truth in the beginning? You clearly knew the mid and low sequences of several other pathways." Katerina turned her body as her white gown fluttered. She said ethereally, "We all need to approach the primordial. We are all her children." As she spoke, surging but silent black flames soared over the huge sailboat which was dozens of meters long. The flames covered every corner as they burned silently without injuring any of the pirates on the Black Death, as though they were clearing up any accumulated dust. The stacked colors quickly receded, and the indescribable transparent figure went far into the distance. Klein's spirituality suddenly stirred as he felt that the items he had left on the Black Death had all vanished. As expected of a demoness of unaging, Klein sighed. Just as he was about to say something, he felt himself plummet. He had left the spirit world with Azek. He found themselves in a mountain valley with a river flowing. There were fertile fields with a manor and town that was built in a Loanese style. Klein looked around him and discovered that he was standing in a dark cemetery that had long been abandoned. "Mr. Azek," he shouted in puzzlement. Azek walked to a grave with a broken tombstone that was covered in weeds. He said solemnly, "After meeting Katerina Pell, I recalled some matters again. I once told you that in a particular dream, in one of my lives, I had a daughter. She had soft black hair and enjoyed sitting in a swing I made myself while requesting sweets from me. When traversing the spirit world, I suddenly sensed the call of my bloodline." Klein was infected with his emotions as he asked solemnly, "Is this her?" Azek nodded and crouched down. He touched the halved tombstone as his bronze face wore a gentle, sorrowful, and confused look. "This is her grave. If I recall correctly, she's been dead for 926 years. 926 years. Klein wanted to say something, but he was stopped by that extended period of time. If it wasn't for the churches compelling people to be buried in cemeteries and providing a certain degree of surveillance, it would have been hard to find this grave and tombstone, since there hadn't been any all-out war since the Fifth Epoch. A human's life was on the order of decades, but this was 926 years. After a long moment of silence in the cemetery, Azek got up again and grabbed Klein's shoulder. "I'll send you back first." After a few minutes of traversing the spirit world, Klein saw the white bed sheets and yellowish-brown floorboards. Azek pressed down on his hat and said in a deep voice, "I'll continue my journey while you continue on your adventures." Klein nodded. Just as he was about to say something, he saw Mr. Azek curl his lips and smile. "Were you afraid that I would become an evil person like a demoness after fully recovering my memories?" Before Klein could reply, Azek sighed. "I'm also very worried. But I have a greater desire for discovering myself." After saying that, the surrounding aqueous void around him rippled as he vanished from the room. For a long period of time, Klein stood in his spot, silent. He shook his head and laughed silently as he consoled himself. "Perhaps when the time comes, I'll already be a powerhouse at the level of Angel. I can establish a treatment facility that treats antisocial personalities and have Miss Justice be the head doctor." Retracting his thoughts, Klein sat down and habitually reflected over his operation. "I originally thought that I could graze a demoness of affliction and obtain Death's Chronicles while making further progress in the human disappearances. Who knew that the development and outcome were completely out of my expectations? I only managed to complete the initial goals. Sigh, I cannot incite Mr. Azek to take action since he hasn't completely recovered. Furthermore, the person we were facing was a demoness of unaging. What's most important is to be strong myself. Relying on myself is better than asking for help from others. Heh. On careful consideration, I do rely on myself most of the time. I can attack the human disappearance cases from the angle of the buyer, that crazy Captain Connors Victor." Klein changed his sitting posture and nodded to himself as he murmured inwardly, "The greatest gain that I received was to establish the preliminary acting principles of a faceless. It's to get into character and be detached, overcome any aversions, and to be careful about being too immersed in the role. This way, by relying only on simple ordinary real acting, perhaps it will take a year or two to digest the potion. But for me, I should be able to fully digest it in about 4 to 6 months." After reflecting on the matter, Klein prepared to sleep. He planned on taking down the radio transceiver from above the gray fog once it was daybreak, so as to establish communications with the magic mirror, Arrodes. Of course, he had to first divine the level of danger above the gray fog. Chapter 590. Arrodes's bottom line early in the morning, above the gray fog. Klein conjured a pen and paper as he deliberated over the divination statement. Using the radio transceiver is dangerous. After carefully checking the statement twice, he took out the spirit pendulum under his left sleeve and began divining. During this process, he was on high alert and was somewhat afraid. He was like a child covering his ears while lighting firecrackers. If the outcome would involve the true creator or the primordial demoness, then he would encounter danger simply from divining it. If it were any other person, they would only end up losing control or dying. However, Klein had the gray fog to shield him and prevent him from having such a tragic outcome. Hence, it was obvious that anything that happened above the gray fog was better than courting death in the real world. He was afraid that the using it repeatedly would allow the evil gods to lock onto him and personally pay him a visit. He quickly entered the state of cogitation and silently recited the divination. After chanting 7 times, he knew the answer without opening his eyes, since he was completely fine sitting there in his seat and wasn't suffering from any extreme pain. When Klein looked at the dangling topaz, he discovered that it was indeed spinning counterclockwise. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief and immediately returned to the real world and began preparing a ritual to bring the radio transceiver from above the gray fog to the real world. After about half an hour, he finally heard the radio transceiver produce its clickety-clack. An illusory piece of white paper was spat out with lines of Loanese words written on it. I'm here. Great Master, is that you? Why does it feel like it's craning its neck? Klein suddenly recalled the emoticons from his previous life. It was an adorable alpaca that craned its neck out. He took 2 steps forward and tersely answered in a reserved manner. Amidst clicking sounds, more illusory paper was spat out. Your loyal and humble servant, Arrodes, at your service. Klein hid his discomfort in the depths of his heart and asked, Arrodes, tell me, where is Roy King from the Life School of Thought? Due to the chubby apothecary's description, he knew that the organization developed itself based on a master and apprentice system. He inferred that they grasped the 2 beyonder pathways of monster and apothecary. This matched the characteristics of the Life School of Thought. Meanwhile, Klein prepared Roy King's picture, with the intention of relying on himself rather than on others. The tapping sounds intensified as Arrodes produced a portrait with the radio transceiver. It was none other than Roy King with his hair neatly combed back while wearing a framed pair of glasses. Is this him? A line of Loanese appeared behind the portrait. Klein nodded. Yes. Arrodes made the radio transceiver's tapping sound turn abnormally brisk. Great Master, the person you wish to find is imprisoned in the Governor General's office of the City of Generosity, Byam. Locked in the Governor General's office? Klein frowned slightly and wasn't in a rush to continue asking. He said with confidence and frankness, All right, according to your rules, it's your turn to ask. Tap, tap, tap. Arrodes used the radio transceiver to produce a smiley face and a line of text. I've already asked, and you have already answered. When did that happen? Klein was taken aback before looking at the content before the illusory piece of paper. He saw the previous question. Is it him? This works. That actually counts? In that instant, Klein finally understood how much freedom Arrodes had to its rules. Against any ordinary person, it could be as strict and vile as it wanted. It even needed spectators, but when it came to Klein, those rules were ignored, and he blatantly made it easy. How did this guy adopt such a personality? Klein considered for 2 seconds before asking another question. Arrodes, do you know the book Grosel's Travels? Arrodes fell silent for 2 seconds before making the radio transceiver type. It spat out more illusory paper. Great Master, your question is too nice for me. All I needed to do was answer yes to be done with the question. I've modified the question a little, changing it to, tell me what you know about Grosel's Travels. This is a very magical book. Many of its owners have vanished. I'm unable to tell who its creator is, but I'm certain that it first appeared among the dragons, after the disappearance of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. It appeared after the City of Miracles, Liveseed, which was conjured by the Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt. I might be able to recommend this to Miss Justice. She might be interested. If she really wishes to buy it, as a middleman, I can study it ahead of time above the gray fog. If something bad happens from the study, resulting in the complete destruction of the book, I can tell her that the seller went back on their word and a refund was made. Thinking of this, being a platform is really promising. Klein's thoughts raced as he said to the radio transceiver, "It's your turn. I do want to know what kind of odd question you can ask." Klein thought silently. Arrodes didn't pause as he produced a line in Loanese. "Great Master, I've already asked and you have already answered. When did that happen?" Klein looked in confusion and amusement at the first few pages of illusory paper before finally seeing the so-called question at the beginning. "Great Master, is that you? I have to say that this magic mirror named Arrodes really shows no shame when it tries to suck up to me. However, such a paired question format really satisfies an OCD. It's like the AND operator back when I studied programming languages myself." Klein cleared his throat and continued asking, "Why was Roy King imprisoned in the Governor General's office?" The radio transceiver produced its clickety-clack and spat out illusory paper. Ever since the disappearance of the Snake of Mercury from the Life School of Thought, the organization fractured and encountered plenty of danger. Some even died at the hands of the Rose School of Thought. The Life School of Thought developed in a secretive manner with the master and apprentice format, but they have an elder council among the upper echelons. They harmonize the conflicts between the different internal factions. Since the Fifth Epoch, the Elder Council changed to a more trendy name known as the Fate Council. There are 7 counselors, and the Snake of Mercury is the president. Roy King's teacher is one of the Fate counselors and had got into trouble after the Snake of Mercury's disappearance. And before this, he had handed an important sealed artifact of the Life School of Thought to Roy King. This is the reason why Roy King was secretly captured by the lone military. The disappearance of the Snake of Mercury? Klein instantly made the connection to Willa Septon, who was hiding in Backland, as well as the other Snake of Mercury that had been pursuing him without ever showing its face. Klein suspected the other Snake of Mercury to be Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. The Life School of Thought Snake of Mercury is definitely not the one searching for Willa Septon, as he has had plenty of opportunities to contact his organization and not be missing. Perhaps it's Willa Septon or a third snake. This cannot be determined. Klein gently nodded and said to the radio transceiver, "Ask. I'm sure you haven't asked me any other questions." "Hee, let's see what you'll ask. I have to say, people have a little bit of masochism in them. Others are afraid of Arrodes's questions, but it has already waved off 2 questions for me. Now, I do wish for it to formally ask me a question." Klein waited with piqued interest. Tap, tap, tap. The radio transceiver's sound suddenly became somewhat solemn as the illusory piece of paper spat out with increasing difficulty. "Well, Great Master, what should I do to be a better, loyal and humble servant? I've underestimated your bottom line." Klein restrained his exasperated expression as he replied in a deep voice, "Just maintain your present state." "All right." The tapping sounds became lighter again. "The aura is about to disperse. Your loyal and humble servant, Arrodes, awaits to be at your service." Finally, Arrodes added a drawing of a hand waving. "It's really talented." "That's right, it's not hard for a magic mirror that knows so much, to know such things." Klein watched as the radio transceiver turned silent. He took a few steps and sat by the edge of the bed, considering the matter regarding Roy King. He had no intention of infiltrating Byam's Governor General's office and rescuing Roy King under the military's tight security. This was because he didn't know the man at all, and he hadn't even seen him before. The only connection they had was through the chubby apothecary. The basement of the Church of Storms definitely has many Beyonders locked up there. But what has that got to do with me? Klein chuckled as he shook his head. In the information provided to him by Arrodes, Klein noticed that the mystical item which Admiral of Blood Seigneur had, which made him sufficiently lucky, came from the Life School of Thought. There was a high probability that the faction backing this pirate admiral was the Rose School of Thought. They were taking advantage of the Snake of Mercury's disappearance, so they could kill members of the Life School of Thought. This also reminds me that I need to be more careful than before when dealing with pirate admirals. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy had gotten demoness of an aging Katerina Pell without any notice. The other pirate admirals wouldn't be without their supporters. They often represent a faction, an organization. Admiral of Blood is backed by the Rose School of Thought, while Admiral of Stars is backed by the Moses Ascetic Order, as well as for our Tarot Club. The backer of Admiral Hell is likely the Numinous Episcopate and the King of the Five Seas. As for Vice Admiral Iceberg, she's likely backed by the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. The backers for Vice Admiral Deep Sea and Vice Admiral Dusk are currently unknown, but it's definitely impossible that they relied solely on themselves to reign supreme over the seas for so many years. Now on second thought, which faction was backing Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos? The one that gave him creeping hunger, or the unspeakable organization that instigated him to assassinate Duke Negan? Yes, I must be careful not to expose my intention of hunting pirate admirals in the future. Furthermore, I can only make one attempt and immediately distance myself if I fail. As Klein's thoughts varied, he suddenly thought of something. The paper crane that was personally folded by that snake of Mercury, Willa Septon, was still with him. Chapter 591. Making good use of things. Klein's memories of the paper crane were still fresh on his mind. Back then, Willa Septon had used this item to locate Dr. Aaron's astral projection and injected information into him while he was dreaming of the spirit world in his dreams. It created a revelation that evolved into a specific dream. Klein later exchanged a paper crane. He had folded himself for Willa Septon's and had gone above the grey fog to make a divination. He failed to gain any effective conclusions until Dr. Aaron's wife got pregnant. By calculating the time and from his understanding of the situation between a Sequence 1 and Sequence 0, he guessed that Willa Septon was performing a cyclic restart, and he guessed that Will was in an intense battle with another snake of fate for the position of Sequence 0. And the nightmare that came with the paper crane was only an auxiliary outcome. Its true purpose was to help Willa Septon secretly become a fetus. What was most humorous about this matter was that the paper crane that Klein had folded had ended up being treated as the original from Willa Septon, and the Nighthawks had used even cruder means to replicate one to swap them. Willa Septon's paper crane had always been above the grey fog after I had thrown it up there. I nearly forgot about it. Performing divination on it can only gain an extremely vague revelation. If there weren't any other developments, it would be hard to infer that the child conceived by Dr. Aaron's wife was Will Arrodes. On the contrary, Will Arrodes can use it to locate it in the spirit world, just like how Arrodes can rely on the grey fog's aura to connect to the radio transceiver via the spirit world. There seems to be some possibility for this matter. Klein suddenly sat straight and had an extremely creative idea. He wanted to use the paper crane to communicate with Willa Septon in a dream. This might not be of any use to me, the present me. There might even be certain hidden dangers, but if Willa Septon is really the snake of fate from the life school of thought, my act of providing him with intelligence will definitely win me a favorable impression. Towards an existence at the level of a king of angels, it's necessary to make investments ahead of time. If I wait until he's really born, I might be repaid dozens of times over. Since I won't die from trying, I can still revive if I die. Although Klein had such a thought, he was in fact very cautious. He planned on divining the danger above the grey fog before deciding on executing his plan. After busying himself and confirming that the danger involved was acceptable, he used a ritual to bring back the paper crane from above the grey fog into the real world. Perhaps it was because it came from a Sequence 1 snake of fate. The paper crane didn't exhibit any peculiarities from its prolonged stay above the grey fog. It remained ordinary. I hope the aura above the grey fog didn't neutralize its uniqueness. Otherwise, Willa Septon won't be able to locate it. The sequence before Snake of Fate is Soothsayer. Would this matter already be within Willa Septon's expectations? The reason why he chose Dr. Aaron is because he's my friend. And by doing so, he can establish a connection with me? Am I being too narcissistic? However, this question is worth suspecting. After Willa Septon used the paper crane to locate Dr. Aaron, he could have directly reincarnated. So why did he repeatedly make him have nightmares? Furthermore, the dream also indicated the struggle between the snakes of fate. To an ordinary person, they would neither understand it or play a meaningful role in this matter. Isn't this like using a gaze to entice a blind person? Willa Septon created the dream for me? Klein frowned slightly and had certain guesses. He suppressed his puzzlement and picked up a fountain pen. As he filled it with ink, he considered a sentence to leave on the paper crane to garner Willa Septon's attention. What should I write? Klein recalled what Arrodes had informed him about the situation with the life school of thought, and he felt that there was one line that could encompass everything while feeling extremely fresh and filled with emotions. That line was, "Your home blew up." This sentence is overly crude and direct while lacking manners. Besides, Willa Septon might not be the president of the life school of thought. Klein deliberated and slightly spread open the paper crane. On the different surfaces, he wrote different words that formed a very short sentence. Roy King has been captured. After doing all of this, Klein put down the fountain pen and placed the paper crane into his wallet, just like Dr. Aaron had done before. In the periphery of the Rörsted Sea, on a gigantic fog-covered island far from the main sea routes, amidst a shrill cry, a blue bird of prey that resembled a shadow had plummeted from the sky and crashed heavily into the ground. It sent soil scattering as its blood splattered. Alger Wilson remained cautious. He stood far away and raised his left hand, which had an iron-black ring on his thumb. He pointed it at the terrifying beyonder creature known as a blue shadow falcon. On the tip of the ring was a spike-like protrusion. It was tainted with old blood, looking ancient and sinister. This was the mystical item he had bought from an artisan, using Steel Mavadi's bounty. He publicly claimed that it cost him £5,200 despite it actually only costing £3,100. The ring's name was Whip of Mind. It could deliver irresistible intense mental damage to an enemy. Apart from that, it could strengthen Alger's mastery of various weapons. Therefore, it wasn't actually very expensive. Back then, the artisan and his friend had two mystical items. One was the Whip of Mind, and the other was the Ring of Witchcraft. The latter had more abilities and high adaptability while costing almost the same as the former. It was a better choice, but after serious consideration, Alger still chose the Whip of Mind. He believed that without such an item, his hunting of the blue shadow falcon would be several times more difficult. This was because it was a beyonder creature that could fly. And reality had proven that his judgment was right. For this, Alger was willing to experience a constant headache, a nagging feeling that made him want to slam his head into a wall. After waiting for several minutes, he saw points of light float up from the blue shadow falcon. 6 crystalline feathers condensed around its wing as Alger heaved a sigh of relief and walked over. He had a flaxen cloth tied around his forehead, and embedded inside it was a blood-red gem that emitted a light that resembled the moonlight. This was meant to be the Vampire Baron inheritance for Emlyn White, but Alger wasn't in a hurry to complete the transaction after obtaining it. Instead, he used the characteristic, which he could use to a certain extent, to add insurance to his hunt for the blue shadow falcon. At times, being a middleman is rather nice. Alger put away the 6 crystalline feathers as he sighed silently. He straightened his body and looked towards the towering mountain peak and dense forest around it on the primitive island. He felt that many indescribable dangers lurked there. My strength is insufficient to explore the area. Alger retracted his gaze and walked towards the island's periphery, constantly wary for any predators around him. Soon, he jumped into the sea, and with his powers as a seafarer, he easily swam into the distance. His ghost ship was anchored there, and his sailors were still sleeping thanks to the sanguine's anesthetic gas. To come to this primitive island, the ship had to steer away from the main sea routes. In a situation where sea monsters lurked while the storms lingered, navigating would take at least 6 hours, with the danger of sinking at any moment. Only a seafarer who was familiar with the route could bring the ship close. Deep into the night, Klein, who had rested an entire day, put down his newspapers and burrowed into bed. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he suddenly thought of a problem. Now that Danitz has returned to the Golden Dream, would it be a waste for me to stay in a large suite alone? Klein nodded indiscernibly and decided to check out at daybreak and switch to another inn. After making up his mind, he quickly fell asleep. Suddenly, his mind became clear from its prior haziness. He knew that some force had intruded into his dream. I'm very impressive to be able to sense the dream intrusion of a snake of fate. No, the gray fog is very impressive. Klein surveyed his surroundings and discovered that he was located in a pitch-black desolate plain. Not far away was a black steeple. This was a scene he had formerly seen in Dr. Aaron's dream, but at this moment, there wasn't a mysterious silver giant snake on the steeple. Klein nodded in thought as he sped up his pace and entered the pitch-black steeple. It remained ancient and decadent. The layout was chaotic, with the staircase occasionally spiraling upwards and dropping downwards diagonally at times. Some of the rooms were normal. Others were upside down, and there were others that were embedded into other parts. Passing through, door after door and wall after wall, Klein once again arrived deep inside the Black Tower. There were tarot cards scattered around here as they clustered towards the ground in the middle, which was slightly protruded. There was a line of silver words and a portrait. The portrait was that of the chubby apothecary, and the silver words formed the sentence, "Inform Dark Will." So the chubby apothecary's name is Dark Will. Will Septon really is the snake of fate from the life school of thought. And I really can use the paper crane to communicate with him in a dream. Klein waited for a moment, and seeing that there weren't any other revelations, he exited the dream and fell asleep again. After daybreak, Klein asked if there weren't any additional charges for checking out at noon. He then put on his top hat and rode a carriage to the Red Theater's entrance. This famous brothel was in its quietest period of the day. It was like it was a ghost house. Klein glanced at it before walking diagonally across to the alley and arriving outside Darkwill's folk herb store. He suddenly sensed something as he looked up at the roof, and he saw a fat owl perched there, looking at him. The chubby apothecary was apparently attempting to tame a beyonder animal before. Klein retracted his gaze in thought as he knocked on the door. Thump, 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 thump. After waiting for a while, he saw Darkwill open the door with his eyes hardly open. "You aren't sick," Darkwill said after observing him. Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's cold expression and politely widened the corners of his mouth. "Good morning, Mr. Apothecary. I've found your teacher." "For real?" Darkwill asked in disbelief. "You just received the mission the day before yesterday." Chapter 592. 3 advancements in a week. What has me receiving the mission the day before yesterday have to do with when I find him? If I didn't need to spend a day waiting for the Snake of Fate, Willa Septon, to locate me, I could have done so 24 hours earlier. That's what professionalism is. Klein answered calmly. "You can choose not to hear what I have to say." Darkwill choked back the words he had prepared as his facial muscles twitched. "Go ahead and say it." Klein described flatly. "I received intel that Roy King has been captured by the military and is presently imprisoned in the Governor General's office. News I received from Arrodes," he added inwardly. "For real?" Darkwill couldn't hold back again as he widened his eyes and blurted out a retort. Klein nodded indiscernibly and said, "My information source is sufficiently reliable. But I have no way of confirming it," Darkwill said in hesitation. "This is because it involves an important sealed artifact of the Life School of Thought," Klein said directly. Darkwill immediately jumped in fright as he took 2 steps back and looked around warily, afraid that someone had heard what Klein had just said. Can this sort of thing be said out on the street? He knows that we're from the Life School of Thought, and he knows that Old Man is involved in an important sealed artifact. I only learned of that from my last communication with him. Darkwill gradually began to believe the adventurer in front of him. Klein swept a glance at the owl who swooped down and landed on the chubby apothecary's shoulder. "You can make your payment. I can't confirm it." "I can't just believe what you say, right?" Darkwill said stubbornly. Then he saw the eyes of the adventurer in front of him turn abnormally cold. He trembled and hurriedly said, "All right. I'll barely count it as you completing the mission." Unwillingly, he took out a wad of cash from a secret pocket in his witch doctor robes and handed Klein 100 pounds in change. Although he was a beyonder, the physical enhancements he obtained from his job as an apothecary and beast tamer wasn't enough to play a role in direct combat. He wasn't necessarily able to defeat an ordinary person with a revolver. As for the beyonder pet he reared, it was also a fellow without any combat powers. Faced with an experienced and resourceful adventurer who was also likely a beyonder, both he and the owl together wasn't necessarily his match. All he could do was act as he said. It wasn't easy saving up that amount of money. He lamented inwardly. It was indeed profitable being an apothecary, even more so when out in the colonies. There were pirates, sailors, and adventurers. There were all sorts of people, and the official organizations were more relaxed on enforcing the rules. He could sell certain banned medicine without anyone coming to knock at his door. For the past 2 months, just the customers from the Red Theater was enough to earn him more than what he previously earned in a year. However, as a beyonder, his expenses were huge as well. The savings he had primarily been expended when advancing to beast tamer. Later he reared a pet and with great difficulty, bought the potion formula and ingredients for it. He also purchased defensive charms for himself, leaving him only a few £100 in savings. Klein received the cash and while counting it, verified their authenticity before putting it in his pocket and leaving. After seeing Klein's figure disappear from the alley, Darkwill's expression sank. "It's too dangerous here. Too dangerous. I have to leave as quickly as possible." As he mumbled, he returned inside his herb store. Once inside, he dragged a brown suitcase and quickly stuffed all sorts of clothes and cash which had been folded neatly into it. Finally, he poured out the notes and coins of different denominations from the cash register, stuffed them into his pocket, and took the fake identification documents he had spent a fortune on. With the brown suitcase, he walked out of his folk herb store. Looking back at the various medicinal ingredients he hadn't finished selling yet, Darkwill's chubby face clearly twitched. He took a breath and locked the door while resisting his aching heart. He went straight for the harbor by getting a rental carriage, heading for Byam's liner ticketing company. It's too dangerous, way too dangerous. Old man has been caught. He's been caught. He sat in the carriage and repeated himself silently as he trembled. In this state, he finally arrived at the ticketing company, and after paying for the carriage, he rushed into the lobby and queued up for the liner to East Balam. Phew, phew. Darkwill kept taking a few deep breaths as he closely followed the customer ahead of him and shifted forward. Get me the first ship out of here, he emphasized to himself. As he sporadically inched forward, Darkwill finally calmed down. His expression occasionally turned twisted before quickly calming down. This repeated numerous times. When there was only one customer left in front of him, Darkwill paused on the spot. Dumbass! You dumbass! He cursed himself and immediately turned around, carried his suitcase, and walked out the ticketing lobby with his identification documents. Klein didn't care how Darkwill was saving his teacher, Roy King. He believed that it wasn't something that needed his concern. They have the life school of thought backing them. Even if they recently fractured, they're an ancient organization that was born in the early 5th epoch, making it have hundreds of years of history. It has a considerable heritage. Chubby Apothecary will naturally be able to find someone to help. If even the life school of thought can't do it, it will be useless even if I get the entire tarot club to help. So there's no need for me to worry for him. The military in Byam has a demigod. Of course, he might not be in the Governor General's office and might be in the military base. Inside the carriage, Klein took out his wallet and looked at the paper crane in it, wondering if he should immediately throw it above the gray fog. I'll wait longer. Perhaps that snake of fate, Willa Septon, might want to give me some perks. I should prepare a pencil next time. I neglected a problem. A paper crane is only this big. Using a fountain pen will quickly leave it without space to write. That will make me unable to contact Willa Septon and end up just waiting passively. And I can't keep the paper crane on me all day. In a few days, I'll send it back to the junk pile above the gray fog. After all, I cannot always have Willa Septon tracking me. I have to be careful. Klein quickly made a decision and returned to the Wind of Azure Inn, packed his suitcase, and checked out of the luxurious suite. To his delight, on Danet's second time here, he had made a prepayment, making him responsible for the 5 solely in fees. Soon, Klein switched to a different district and came to Otom Street, which was close to a Mirror's Leaf Bar. He stayed in an inn called Tiana. He got a clean and simple room which cost him 2 solely 2 pence every day. There was also a complimentary cup of fruit juice squeezed from the gigantic fruit named Tiana. As he drank the slightly sweet milky fruit juice, Klein no longer cared about his image. He slumped into a reclining chair and decided to daze off and take a nap for the next 2 hours before going above the gray fog to browse through the prayers of his believers to experience the different facades people have. Backlund, the White family. Emlyn looked at the blood-red gem that appeared in front of him at the altar, and he seemed to be able to hear it resonating with his blood. After thanking Mr. Fool, he picked up the gem and felt the uniqueness flowing within it, so as to confirm that it was the inheritance from a sanguine baron. As long as I prepare the corresponding inheritance ritual and supplementary ingredients, I'll become a baron. And this isn't difficult at this stage, Emlyn thought with anticipation and glee. According to the human system, I would be a sequence 6 beyonder. The corresponding name is Potions Professor. In the blink of an eye, it was Monday again. Above the fog sea, a fleet was tearing through the thin fog and blue sea. Their flagship was a gigantic sailboat which hung a unique flag on it. It depicted an eyelash-less eye with 10 stars surrounding it. Admiral of Stars Catlia stood by the window of the captain's cabin as she quietly looked at the sunlight that shone through the thin fog until the wall clock produced its cuckoo. She glanced at the time and quickly converted the time to lone time. She then pulled the curtains and sat behind her desk. Placed on the red wooden table were a brass sextant and a light blue celestial globe. The latter's surface had a large swath of blankness, regions that hadn't been explored or were impossible to explore. Catlia reached out her fingers and played with the celestial globe before closing her eyes as she awaited the fool's summoning. Before long, a crimson light flooded her eyes, drowning the prepared her completely. By the time she got used to the changes, she found herself in the holy palace propped up with stone columns. She was before a long mottled bronze table. While Miss Justice was greeting everyone energetically, Catlia also expressed her respects to Mr. Fool, who was still covered in the grayish-white fog. She did a simple sweep, and her black eyes with a slight tinge of purple suddenly constricted. She realized that the Hanged Man, the moon, and the sun who were sitting opposite her had slight changes in their outward spirituality. It was different from before. This indicated that they had advanced. This meant that they had advanced in the past few days. In just a week, 3 Tarot Club members have advanced. It's likely that the Hanged Man and the moon have already reached sequence 6. Is this a coincidence? They happen to consume the potion this week? In terms of probability, there's a possibility. The moon and the sun were purchasing ingredients last week, but this also serves to show that the Tarot Club members advance very quickly. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a coincidence. Of course, it's not strange to advance quickly below sequence 5 once a Beyonder masters the acting method and isn't lacking in resources. From sequence 6 to sequence 5, there's a need for a ritual, and the digestion becomes increasingly difficult. It's difficult for such matters to happen again. Catlia retracted her gaze. Following that, Audrey apologized to Mr. Fool, saying that she hadn't been in contact with the psychology alchemists recently and wasn't able to provide any Roselle diary pages. Furs was in a similar situation. Her teacher was slow in replying to her, and the cold weather outside left her resistant against the idea of heading out. Having just advanced and having many things to settle, Derek wasn't able to produce new ancient myths. Klein could only calmly nod. Upon seeing this, Derek heaved a sigh of relief and turned his head to the other end of the long bronze table. Mr. World, I've obtained the method for separating a Beyonder characteristic from the mental corruption left by a rampager. Don't say it so directly. At the other end of the bronze table, Klein's expression nearly froze. Little son, although you have promised several times in the past, making Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man know of this matter, can't you see that Ma'am Hermit just joined? Klein resisted the urge to facepalm. Chapter 593. Solution: the method for separating a rampager's mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic. The hermit Catlia shot a glance at the world and guessed that he might have obtained 1 to 2 Beyonder characteristics that a rampager left behind. In addition, one of them likely involved the advancement characteristic for the world or someone close to him. This was a very easy inference, since if one didn't use a Beyonder characteristic as the main ingredient of a potion, the mental corruption of a rampager in it didn't matter if it was made into a mystical item. At worst, the negative side effects would be extremely strong, making it equivalent to a sealed artifact, but that didn't mean that there was no way of using it. After adjusting his emotions, Klein controlled the world to answer hoarsely. Write it on a piece of paper and pass it to me. With that said, Klein originally wished to encourage Little Son for being a trustworthy person, but upon considering how the world's image was that of a gloomy and reserved person who didn't say anything else unless he had ulterior motives, he instantly fell into a slight dilemma. No, there's an ulterior motive. By letting Little Son maintain his principles, it will make things a lot easier in the future. To put it simply, it will be easier to fleece him. Of course, I'll have to suffer the damage from his honesty and uprightness as a result. The world is an experienced and shrewd Beyonder in the eyes of Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others. They likely wouldn't notice any problems. Klein's mind raced as he made the world let out a deep laugh. You're really a trustworthy person. Your character is worthy of praise. The Hanged Man pricked up his brows and took the initiative to say to Derek, I'm also interested in the knowledge regarding this. What can I use to trade for this information? He planned to do the transaction if it wasn't too expensive, and he would give up if it exceeded his expectations. After all, he didn't have any use for it at the moment. Having been praised, Derek was still lost in his joy. After 2 seconds of thought, he said with abnormal sincerity, Mr. Hanged Man, there's no need. You've often been giving me suggestions in the past when I was faced with trials. Just treat it as a way of showing my appreciation. If the world is a real person and was drinking, he definitely would have spewed out all the water in his mouth. Thankfully, he's neither drinking, nor is he real. Klein mustered all the Beyonder powers of a clown to ensure his expression remained unchanged. The Hanged Man was briefly at a loss for words. The son's reply was completely out of his expectations. He had been traveling the seas for years and had experienced numerous encounters. His outlook on things was no longer that of black and white, with it mainly shades of gray. At this moment, he felt a baffling sense of guilt. Your character is really worthy of praise, Alger quickly composed himself and praised Little Sunday. Don't copy what I said. Can't you use a different sentence? The world glanced at the hanged man as the fool lamented how wily old foxes were all one and the same. Dumbass. No, he's dumber than an ass. A dumb sheep. The moon Emlyn silently condemned the sun. From this morning, he had been filled with anticipation for this tarot gathering, as he had already advanced to Baron and had wished to find a chance to covertly flaunt himself. They might not be able to tell, apart from Mr. Fool. Mr. Hangman likely can guess it. I should do something later to let them know that I'm an honorable Lord Baron. Emlyn pondered as he listened. Towards Little Sun's words, Justice Audrey didn't feel any guilt or anger, as she knew very well that Mr. Hanged Man had been the one who had been guiding him every time. The others were only occasionally giving suggestions. This is the natural result of being a good person. I hope Mr. Hanged Man will become kinder in the future. She watched this scene in delight and didn't have the urge to spend money to obtain the method for separating the mental corruption from a beyonder characteristic. Derek quickly turned around and obtained Mr. Fool's approval and conjured 2 yellowish-brown goatskin parchments. Klein controlled the world and took a piece. He scanned it impatiently. There are 2 methods. The first is to use an item that can steal the beyonder powers of others. Extract the mental corruption left behind by a rampager, and concoct the beyonder characteristic into a potion before the theft loses effect. This way, the mental corruption will have nowhere to go and will directly dissipate. The second is to hold a ritual and pray to one of the 2 mystical items in our City of Silver. Use its feedback to shatter the beyonder characteristic and let the mental corruption expire. After that, the beyonder characteristic will automatically gather together slowly. I only managed to obtain the corresponding ritual's procedure, and was unable to obtain the precise description of the item. Only the elders of the 6-member council have the right to know it and preside over such a ritual. The ritual's procedure is... Thoughts went through Klein's mind as he nearly forgot to control the dummy, the world. The first method is indeed something I never considered before. The sealed artifact, Blood Vessel Thief, behind the Chinese gate in Contingency City is able to steal a target's beyonder powers. By viewing a mental corruption as one of them, there's nothing wrong with this logic. But here comes the problem. The mental corruption inside the all-black eye isn't that of an ordinary beyonder but from the evil god, true creator. Regardless of if it's the beyonder who's stealing the power or a mystical item of a similar trait, it will not be able to withstand such mental corruption. The former has 100% chance of losing control, while the latter will directly be corrupted. In theory, I can sacrifice a similar mystical item and use it to replace the all-black eye's corruption. However, the timing has to be done perfectly without any errors. Otherwise, the 2 items might end up corrupted. Klein quickly analyzed the viability of the first option. As for the second option, it was similar to his and Edwina's previous guess. Only the details were somewhat different. The 2 powerful mystical items in the City of Silver are, at best, grade 0. Basically, it can't be a true god sequence 0 remains. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in such a pathetic state in the forsaken land of the gods. Therefore, does it mean that in order to shatter a beyonder characteristic, one doesn't need a god's strength? It's enough to do it at the level of an angel? According to Little Sun, an angel is equivalent to a subsidiary god and can barely be considered a god. Yes, this matter can be verified. See, God Calvetua only obtained a portion of Calamity Kohinum's characteristic. The remaining part is in the Book of Calamity. There might even be a third part. I wonder where it's hidden since it helps this high elf, at the level of an angel, be able to resist death. In short, it can be seen that Kohinum's beyonder characteristic was split into at least 2 parts. This is essentially the same as shattering a beyonder characteristic. With all the evidence validating each other, I can make a preliminary conclusion that as long as the ritual is right, the feedback of a powerhouse at the angel level will be able to shatter a beyonder characteristic. Then, here comes the problem. Where do I find an angel? Mr. Azek might be one at his peak, but he clearly hasn't recovered yet. As for saints, Snake of Fate, Willa Septon, is only a fetus that hasn't even been born at the moment. Klein didn't spend too much time thinking, deciding to consider how to resolve the problem after the tarot gathering ended. With that, Alger quickly scanned the area and gained an understanding to a certain degree. Towards this he had a theory. Getting the world to seek the method to separate the mental corruption from a beyonder characteristic is likely a test Mr. Fool had given to his blessed. But does this imply that Mr. Fool's strength has only recovered to the level of a saint and not an angel? Otherwise, there's no need to go through such trouble. He could have directly removed it. How long has it been? It's just been 7 months and Mr. Fool has already recovered to this extent.
Right. He can already respond in place of sea god Calvetua.
In another 1 to 2 years, he will likely be able to escape from his seal. Standing at the pinnacle as an angel, he will just be 1 step short of the ultimate goal. Ignoring the hanged man's reaction, Katlia looked at the hanged man and thought for a few seconds before chuckling. I'm not sure if those methods include one of the methods I know of. I can provide it for free. An unshadowed of the sun pathway can directly cleanse away the mental corruption in a beyonder characteristic. Ma'am Hermit is a lot more proactive than the last time. Has she adjusted her state of mind? Or does she have a motive? Or could it be that she's discovered that everyone else is a weakling, so there's no need to be too careful? Klein was first surprised with Katlia's attitude before being delighted that he had obtained a third method. It was from the sun pathway which the City of Silver lacked. But I can't find the help of an unshadowed, although I do have an incomplete unshadowed potion formula.
He controlled the world to deliberate for a moment before having him turn to Katlia to laugh deeply.
Thank you for your generosity, Ma'am Hermit. Following that, he switched to the demeanor of a salesman and asked Derek, do you know of a book named Grozel's Travels? Derek thought seriously before honestly shaking his head.
No.
Klein nearly failed to continue what he had to say, but thankfully, he steadied himself and let the world explain himself. It's a magical book that originates from dragons. Many of its owners have vanished. Originates from dragons? Audrey keenly noticed this important point as she asked with interest. Yes, a beyonder plans on selling it for £8,000, the world said hoarsely. He didn't raise the price above Edwina's offer because he had yet to bargain with her. This was where he could profit on the trade. Besides, even if Edwina insisted on £8,000, he could still obtain Grozel's Travels and study it. It was worth the time he spent closing the deal. Audrey pursed her lips slightly as she darted her eyes around a little and cautiously asked, what's so magical about it? It requires further study. The world chose to be honest. I'll consider it. Audrey wasn't in a hurry to agree to it because £8,000 was also a considerable sum of money to her as well. Especially with her having just been reimbursed for lie, it was very difficult for her father, Earl Hole, to accept a book of unknown purpose. And if she were to rely on herself, it would take her at least 3 to 4 months. This was built on the premise that she had already purchased the psychiatrist's beyonder characteristic for Susie. Hence, she turned to ask the world about the psychiatrist beyonder characteristic. I mainly spent this week hunting Vice Admiral Ailment and failed. I didn't find a grazing target to switch to. Klein was instantly left somewhat embarrassed, feeling as though the world's shrewd image had been damaged. Chapter 594. The World's Commission. Thankfully, the world didn't have the ability to blush red. As long as he wasn't controlled, there was no change to his state. He chuckled darkly. Another few more days. Audrey nodded with a reserved attitude and didn't rush him. This was because Susie didn't express any desire in advancing any time soon. After all, she was only a dog. The Hanged Man, the Moon, and the Sun had just advanced a few days ago, so they were in the stage of converging their spirituality and practicing their new beyonder powers. They had no desire to purchase the subsequent potion formulas or corresponding sanguine inheritance. They calmly waited until the transaction phase came to an end. Besides, they didn't have spare cash. Although Alger had lowered the price Emlyn White had to pay for the Sanguine Baron inheritance to £4,300 and £300 in commission, allowing him to earn £1,400, he had spent quite a bit on the whip of mind. All he had left was £1,445. After purchasing the Sanguine Baron inheritance, new dolls, and doll dresses, he still had £2,300 in savings. Although it seemed like a sizable amount, the subsequent ingredients were that of a Sanguine Viscount. It would cost at least £8,000. As for Derek, he had exchanged all his merit points that he had previously accumulated, and he was waiting to be sent out for a patrolling or exploration mission. Furs and Audrey were similarly not seeking to purchase the potion formulas of the subsequent sequences since they could obtain them from their own resource channels. Furthermore, there was no need to hide it or waste money at the Tarot Club. Audrey simply wasn't too nitpicky when it came to money. It didn't mean she was dumb. On the other hand, Katlia was still observing and wasn't in a rush to reveal what she needed. On the other hand, she didn't believe that the other Tarot Club members apart from Mr. Fool could provide anything she needed.
After all, to a pirate admiral who had advanced to Sequence 5 for years, what she desired most was the level of demigod. Therefore, she only looked calmly at the sun and the others, with her slightly dark purple eyes, and without making any attempts at speaking.
Klein thought for a moment and controlled the world to add, "Is anyone able to obtain a mystical item with very potent offensive strength?" The target of his question was directed at the hermit.
This was because only Admiral of Stars, who had traveled the seas for so many years, could satisfy his request. Even the hanged man and that artisan he knew couldn't do it unless he could provide them with a corresponding Sequence 6 or even a Sequence 5 Beyonder characteristic.
Katlia fell silent for 2 seconds before slowly shaking her head. "If something similar appears at the Beyonder gatherings I participate in, I'll help you take note." All these years, she had killed several Beyonders and had indeed obtained a certain number of Beyonder characteristics and mystical items. But they were either rewarded to her pirate subordinates, or she had exchanged them for 2 powerful items that greatly enhanced her strength and survivability. She didn't have anything to spare. Furthermore, she needed the 2 items and wouldn't sell them before she advanced to the level of demigod. From the looks of it, Admiral of Stars isn't a well-to-do person either. A huge faction implies large expenses.
Klein silently sighed and made the world thank her with his hoarse voice.
With the transactions quickly coming to an end, he controlled the world to look at Furs.
"I wish to entrust you with a mission."
"Me?" Furs was a little surprised. Could it be something like buying a radio transceiver again?
She thought as the corners of her mouth twitched slightly.
The world nodded. "Go to William Street, which borders West Borough and Empress Borough, and circle the place. Do it once every 2 to 3 days. Take note of any abnormalities. If there are any, then inform me immediately." He didn't use Mr. Fool to bring focus on the matter, as everyone was already used to it and experienced. Furthermore, beneath William Street was precisely the location of the Tudor family's ruins where the evil spirit was lingering. Abnormality? What would be considered abnormal? Furs asked, feeling puzzled and cautious. There might be something abnormal about William Street in Backlund? Audrey was originally not very interested in the topic, but at that moment, she pricked up her ears and paid close attention. She trusted Mr. World's ability to gather intelligence to a great extent.
The great smog of Backlund was evidence of his ability.
West Borough. Empress Borough. Sounds like it's located at Lone's capital, Backlund. Miss Magician is presently in Backlund? Indeed. She looks ordinary, but she isn't in any way. To a secret organization, members in a city are often more powerful in other places. Of course, she might also be like me. A coincidence of fate because she requested to be roped in. Katlia swept a glance at Furs and quickly analyzed the information revealed from the conversation. Alger was suddenly interested since he knew that the world was the representative of Mr. Fool's blessed. Whatever he paid attention to had a high chance of involving a conflict at the upper echelons. Just what secret lies within that street named William Street? Alger couldn't help but try to guess at the deeper truth. How would I know what abnormalities there will be? Klein mumbled before getting the world to answer gloomily. I believe there will be sufficient abnormalities. I have to warn you that if you really notice anything abnormal, do not attempt to investigate it on your own or hire someone to do the investigation. It will be very dangerous. How much do you think is an adequate reward? Very dangerous. Furs instinctively wished to decline the mission. However, considering how immense the influence of the great smog of Backlund was, one that even affected her, she wasn't sure if this abnormality wouldn't cause her harm. As such, she became hesitant. After a few seconds, she changed her languid seating posture and said, 100 pounds.
Much lower than I imagined.
The world chuckled. Furs spread her hands and said, It's because it's for myself as well. I'll just treat it as people observation in order to gather material for my novel. That's right. I can't stay at home all day. It's time for me to get out. I have to push forward the matter of acting as a trickmaster. Just conjuring tricks to amuse Zio isn't enough to digest it. How should I act? Join a circus to perform tricks? Or should I do individual performances at different squares? I don't have to be worried about how the people I know view me. As an author, life experience is a basic trait. Furs's thoughts gradually dispersed.
After settling this matter, Klein made the world turn his head to the hanged man and chuckle darkly.
I received intel that the Church of Storms has taken action.
The matter at Bansi Harbor has been preliminarily resolved.
Having been drifting out at sea for the past week, Alger, who hadn't had any contact with the church, immediately replied with a solemn voice, "What's the final outcome?" "There won't be a Bansi harbor for some time," the world replied with a concealed smile. At this moment, Audrey and company realized what they were talking about. That was the place with the ancient name Binzi, and it had the present name of Bansi. It was the place where descendants of the King of Angels Medici resided. Is Mr. World implying that the Church of Storms has leveled Bansi Harbor? That's really in their style. That's good too. There's no need to worry that the innocent there will be corrupted. I wonder if the King of Angels Medici appeared or escaped. Would the Pontiff of the Church of Storms appear in person, or was a Grade 0 sealed artifact used? Audrey heaved a sigh of relief as she asked with brightened eyes, "Mr. World, do you know of the specifics?" "No, no one knows, other than the upper echelons of the Church of Storms." The world stole a glance at the hanged man. The hanged man fell silent, feeling the burning ambition in his chest once more. "I want to become a member of the Church's upper echelons," he emphasized to himself. The hermit Catlia, who had joined the tarot gathering a second time, basically didn't understand what they were talking about. As a pirate admiral, she was no stranger to Bansi Harbor, but she didn't know what had happened there. She also had no idea why the Church of Storms would destroy the place and why it would require a long period of time to rebuild it. It should be a very serious matter that deals with the higher-ups. The members of the Tarot Club seems to be aware of the reason. Although their sequences aren't high, they seem to know a lot and are involved in many matters, apart from the sun. This is the reason why Mr. Fool tacitly agreed to have them establish this gathering? Through the Tarot Club, they will indirectly influence various matters of different organizations? Catlia once again re-evaluated her understanding of the other members and was increasingly impressed with them. She still maintained her silence and didn't inquire. This left Audrey, who was waiting to flaunt via answering in response to the hermit's puzzlement, disappointed. Even for Ma'am Hermit, it's unlikely that she'll be involved in matters regarding a King of Angels. No, she might not even know about the existence of a King of Angels. Audrey thought spontaneously. After talking about the outcome of Bansi Harbor and waiting for a moment, Emlyn White immediately cleared his throat and said, "Thanks to Mr. Hangman's help, I'm already a baron." "I have a question. As a sanguine, do I need to use the acting method like you humans do in order to expedite the so-called digestion after advancing to a baron, so as to better grasp the beyonder characteristic?" His back was extremely sharp as his neck was slightly elevated while his chin was slightly tipped upwards. "I'm sorry. Mr. Fool isn't able to answer this question of yours. But in theory, it's required. After all, you are using the inheritance of others." Klein leaned back in his chair and sat amidst the grey fog as he leisurely looked at the other members of the Tarot Club. Catlia scanned her surroundings and said, "A sanguine baron corresponds to the Sequence 6 Potions Professor?" "Yes," Emlyn replied, unable to hide his smile. He wasn't stupid. From the previous transactions and interactions, he had determined the sequences of the other members apart from the world. He believed that he was one of the strongest members of the Tarot Club. Of course, this was excluding Mr. Fool and the recently recruited Ma'am Hermit. Mr. Moon is already at Sequence 6? Why does he seem more immature than the sun? Audrey pursed her lips. At that moment, Catlia said, "It requires acting because this pathway only has the name vampire at Sequence 7. As for you, you were born in that state. There's no need to act, but it's required for the other sequences." "Ma'am Hermit, which pathway does that Sequence 7 belong to?" Audrey blinked her eyes as she curiously asked before Emlyn White could say a word. Chapter 595. Domain. Without waiting for the hermit to answer, Audrey added, "If you believe this is an important piece of information and isn't something to be given for free, then I can provide you with some payment." "No, there's no need to. Anyone familiar with the Fainapotter's Church of Earth Mother will have some understanding of this." Catlia didn't doubt Miss Justice's sincerity when it came to the principle of equal exchange. She believed that Miss Justice was fully capable of satisfying her price in terms of wealth and resources, but she decided to provide the information for free. Firstly, it raised Miss Justice's impression on her and would build a foundation for any future transactions. Secondly, by providing the information, she could observe the reactions of the members and estimate their standing in their own organizations and factions. "I'm very familiar with the Earth Mother's blessed Bishop Utravsky, but I didn't know anything about that. Of course, I truly am a little scared of him. His height and build are just too intimidating. Every time I'm there, I only seek out Emlyn White."
Sitting at the end of the long bronze table, Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner.
Katlia didn't pause as she continued. Vampire is from the moon pathway. The corresponding sequence 9 is apothecary. Sequence 8 is beast tamer. Sequence 6 is potions professor. Sequence 5 is scarlet scholar. Sequence 4 is shaman king. I'm not sure about the higher sequences. Ahem. Emlyn White coughed. Ma'am Hermit, I have to emphasize that it's sanguine, not vampire. Heh. I won't object it if you call those humans who consume the characteristics of my kinsmen vampires. I would even be very agreeable to it. So vampire is from the apothecary pathway. So is shaman king. It's no wonder they revere the primordial moon and not the goddess. Could the scarlet lunar corona, that Ma'am Sharon obtained, be from a dead scarlet scholar or sanguine viscount? Apart from being able to recreate the effects of a full moon and neutralizing the corresponding effects, it can provide terrifying speed, unimaginable recovery speed, and rather powerful darkness-related spells. The negative effects can be neutralized by drinking the fresh blood of the living. Indeed, it does seem to be a result of a sanguine. Among the various jobs of this pathway, there are some that resemble the seer pathway. There's no connection between the sequences, while there are some that have an obvious progression. How strange. Klein joined the bits of breadcrumbs together, feeling somewhat enlightened and puzzled. Alger, Furs, and company were either in thought, listening in relish, or pretending to be disinterested. Everyone had different reactions, but Katlia was able to figure out that they didn't understand much about vampires prior to this. They are low or mid-ranking members in their organizations or factions. They match the characteristics of being recently pulled into the Tarot Club and at the stage of rapidly advancing. The world didn't react. Either he's very staid, or he long knew of the matter regarding vampires, or both. After repeated observations, I have to admit that the world is the Tarot Club member that needs to have the most attention paid to and be guarded against. Audrey listened with great interest as she thought over it carefully. As though she was attending a family education class, she raised her hand slightly. Ma'am Hermit, why are the sequences in the moon pathway seemingly unrelated? The Hermit Katlia looked at Miss Justice and discovered that the dress and accessories she wore were completely different from the last gathering. There was no repeat, but it exuded her luxurious and noble bearing. As her mind went adrift, she seemed to see the portrait of the queen back when she was young. Every piece of clothing she wore was completely different. The same set of clothing was never worn a second time at a formal event. After a moment of silence, Katlia said, a pathway sequence doesn't necessarily need to be related or superficially connected. The common trait is that this pathway corresponds to the god's domain. For example, the moon represents spirituality, plants, beauty, parts of life, parts of darkness, and parts of mystery. Therefore, this pathway has apothecary of the plant domain, vampire of the life domain, and beast tamer of the intersection of life and spirituality. Sanguine. Emlyn White emphasized and lifted his chin slightly. This should be why us sanguine are very handsome and beautiful. No, that's not the case. The vampires I've seen are all disgusting and ferocious. Derek retorted weakly in his heart. It can be explained in such a manner? It's quite different from Captain's and Daly's explanations. Different pathways represent the domain possessed by a sequence 0. Or could it be that the two combined is the most accurate answer? I wonder what the domains the sequence 0 of the seer pathway represents. From the symbol behind my chair, it represents strangeness and change? Klein's expression didn't change as his mind whirled. Audrey easily understood Ma'am Hermit's explanation, and couldn't help but guess the name of her pathway's sequence 0. It's definitely dragon. There are many species of dragons. Many powers are not contained within this pathway. It's closer to the domain represented by the mind dragon. I wish Mr. Fool can quickly find the card of blasphemy of this corresponding pathway. That Grozel's travels originates from dragons. I wonder if it has anything to do with a mind dragon. At this moment, Emlyn asked as a form of validation. That is to say that to successfully become a sanguine viscount, I similarly have to act as a potions professor, even if I'm a favorite of the moon. My dear Emlyn, I know you are trying to bring attention to the latter half of your sentence. Klein nearly reached out his right hand to pinch his chin. This was also one of the reasons why he had entrusted Miss Magician to check for abnormalities in William Street. He ultimately felt that Emlyn White, a vampire who didn't enjoy going out or socializing, was rather unreliable at present. Another reason was that he knew that he was being controlled by the sanguine's upper echelons in secret. Getting him to head to William Street made it easy to expose the matter regarding the underground ruins. Yes. Katlia nodded. The exchange continued, and as it came to a close, Audrey seemed to recall something.
She turned her body and looked towards the end of the long bronze table.
Mr. Fool, the second round of the Civil Servant Unified Examination officially ends today. What's left is the final interview. Her tone was brisk and with clear, delightful emotions. It was like an excellent student reporting her results to her parents. From her point of view, the Civil Servant Unified Examination was a suggestion raised by Mr. Fool in passing. She had pushed forward the idea via inconspicuous methods, the first time she had attempted to use her beyonder powers to change reality. Therefore, she had always paid great attention to it, often reporting the situation to the suggester. The second round of the examinations are over? I wonder if Benson can pass and have the opportunity of entering the final interview. Klein leaned back and suddenly felt wistful. He nodded slightly and said with a smiling tone, "Not bad." Audrey, who had been praised by Mr. Fool, became happier.
She felt that she was indirectly changing the fates of many people, allowing people who were stuck in the lower middle classes to have a chance at entering the middle and upper classes.
When Katlia heard this exchange, she couldn't help but frown. She felt that this was very different from the style the Tarot Club had previously shown. Could it be that the reforms of the past half a year in the Lone Kingdom were a result of the Tarot Club's turning of the wheels? As a young noble lady, Miss Justice played an important role? If that's the case, I have to re-evaluate my views.
Although the members aren't of a high sequence and are low-ranking members of their organizations, they're still able to influence the situation of the world to a certain extent. Katlia retracted her gaze and considered whether she wanted to use her different resource channels to figure out the backstory of Lone Kingdom's reforms. After a few minutes of exchanges, the Fool Klein announced the end of the gathering. While Miss Justice and company got up to express their farewells, he severed the connection and leaned back into his seat. He silently watched the endless grayish-white fog around him for a very long while.
Backlund. In a coffee shop next to King's Avenue.
Melissa was holding a porcelain teaspoon as she gently stirred the black tea which had a lemon in it.
From time to time, she would turn her head to look out into the faint fog. Her black veiled hat was sitting beside her. Placed in front of her was a plate of the cheapest toast, but she hadn't taken a single bite. She originally imagined that she would anger the coffee shop's owner for sitting there all this while, preventing him from earning more. But she later discovered that there were many people waiting for the end of the test opposite the road like her. As seconds turned into minutes, the water condensing on the glass windows grew thicker. Melissa couldn't help but extend her hand to clean up a relatively clear spot. Finally, she saw a bunch of people surge out of the test venue. The glass-inlaid wooden door of the coffee shop was pushed open as about 8 men and women entered. Just as Benson took off his rather old top and before he could smooth his rather high hairline with his fingers, he discovered his sister standing as she asked nervously, "How did you do? Were the questions tough today?" It might have been considered difficult for others, but it was a piece of cake for me. Mathematics is my forte. Benson looked around and saw everyone discussing it without noticing him. Hence, he chuckled. After the test ended, I saw quite a number of people with blank sheets. Do they think a low-ranking civil servant will have a mathematics secretary? If that's the case, what's the difference between hiring a curly-haired baboon and them? Melissa heaved a secret sigh of relief and looked to her side before turning her head back. Benson, if you're really confident, you should consider the matter regarding the interview. You need to buy a new decent set of clothes. Let's leave that to tomorrow. We should celebrate today. I've already decided on the restaurant. Benson smiled as he pointed outside.
Melissa pursed her lips and looked at her elder brother in an extremely serious manner.
I've already bought the meat and vegetables. Benson locked his gaze with his sister for a few seconds before moving it away in submission. All right, let's go home. Above the gray fog, Klein gradually found his train of thought and calmed his emotions. He began considering how to separate the true creator's mental corruption of the all-black eye. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.